She knelt before a mafia boss and begged for $1 million. Then he said, "Marry me." A surgeon, a dying sister, a devil's bargain struck at 2 a.m. beneath a city that swallows the desperate whole. Anya Carter walked into that casino with a hospital invoice and walked out with a husband she never wanted and a war she never saw coming. This is the story of what happens when survival costs you everything you promised yourself you'd never become. If this story finds you tonight, drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me. Every word of this matters. The rain had been falling for 6 hours straight when Anya Carter finally understood that she had run out of options. Not metaphorically. Not in the quiet, creeping way that desperation usually announces itself. Slowly, politely, giving a person time to adjust. This was the other kind. The kind that arrives at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday with cold water soaking through your coat and a hospital invoice folded so many times the paper has gone soft at the creases, and your hands won't stop shaking no matter how hard you press them against your sides. She stood at the bottom of a staircase she never should have descended. The Black Orchid. That was what Ethan had called it. A private lounge, exclusive clientele, the kind of place where the right introduction opened doors that didn't officially exist. He'd said it like he was doing her a favor, and she'd been too exhausted and too desperate to hear the wrong notes underneath his voice. Now she was standing in an underground casino in Gangnam at 2 a.m, soaking wet, ringed by men in black suits who hadn't spoken a word since she came down the elevator, but whose eyes tracked her every breath with the flat, professional patience of people who hurt other people for a living. The space itself was obscene in its beauty. Low amber light fell across dark marble floors polished to the point of reflection. A bar ran along the far wall, bottles backlit in amber and gold. 3 poker tables occupied the center of the room, though only one was active. Jazz moved through the air from somewhere invisible. Slow, old, bruised at the edges. The kind of music that understood suffering and had simply decided to be elegant about it. Anya didn't notice any of that at first. She noticed him. Kang Min-jae sat at the active poker table alone. No cards in play, no chips stacked in front of him. He wasn't gambling. He was simply occupying the chair the way certain people occupy space, like the room had arranged itself around him and was grateful for the opportunity. 34 years old, according to the things Ethan had let slip during the drive over, and he looked every year of it in the way that men who've survived violent things do, not aged, but compressed, like pressure had removed everything unnecessary and left only the essential architecture behind. Black suit, no tie. The top button of his white shirt open, long fingers resting on the table beside a crystal glass of whiskey that he wasn't drinking. He was watching her. Had been watching her since the elevator doors opened, she realized. Not with hunger. Not with the particular kind of evaluation men like him probably performed on women who appeared uninvited in their private spaces. Something different. Something she couldn't name yet that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up for reasons that had nothing to do with the armed men surrounding her. Ethan was already across the room, walking toward Minji, with his hands open and his smile performing warmth it didn't feel. "Mr. Kang, thank you for seeing us on short notice." Min-jae's eyes didn't move from Anya. "I agreed to see you," he said. His English was clean, accented at the edges, precise. "I don't remember agreeing to anything else." Ethan laughed. That specific laugh he deployed when a room wasn't going the way he wanted, short and slightly too loud and calibrated to sound confident. Anya had heard it hundreds of times over the 3 years they were together. She knew now what she hadn't understood then. It was the sound a man made when he was afraid but couldn't afford to show it. "She's why I'm here," Ethan said. Anya Carter, trauma surgeon, Johns Hopkins training, currently working the International Partnership Program at Yonsei Medical Center. Sharp as anyone you've ever met. And she needs help that only someone in your position can provide. Min-jae finally looked away from her and toward Ethan. The shift was almost imperceptible, but the temperature in the room dropped anyway. "You brought someone here," Min-jae said quietly, without her knowledge of where she was going. It wasn't a question. Anya registered that. He'd read the situation in about 4 seconds and named it accurately, and Ethan had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable before his expression resettled into practiced composure. She knows she's here to meet an investor. I know I was lied to, Anya said. The words came out before she could decide whether to say them. Old habit. 15-hour trauma shifts had burned away most of her capacity for strategic silence. When something was wrong, she identified it out loud and moved to correct it. That instinct didn't switch off just because the room was expensive and the men in it were dangerous. Every eye in the space turned toward her. Min-jae's expression shifted by some fraction of a degree she couldn't precisely measure. His head turned back in her direction. She kept her chin level and her voice steady and tried not to think about the fact that her heart was slamming itself against her sternum, hard enough that she could feel it in her back teeth. He told me you were a private investor who funds medical initiatives. He said you'd helped other people in situations like mine, and that you wanted to meet me before agreeing to anything. He did not mention the armed men, or the underground location, or— She stopped herself, recalibrated. Any of the rest of this. The silence that followed was different from the silence before, heavier, more intentional. Min-jae studied her for a long moment. She made herself hold his gaze. Dark eyes. Not cold exactly. Cold implied absence, and there was nothing absent about the way he looked at her. There was instead a quality of absolute attention that felt almost physical, like standing too close to something that generated its own field. Ethan, he said, not breaking eye contact with Anya. Yeah. Leave us. Ethan's composure cracked visibly. We had an arrangement. We had a conversation, Min-jae said, still not looking at him. Those aren't the same thing. Leave. Two of the suited men near the wall moved before Ethan could respond. Not aggressively. They simply repositioned themselves between him and Min-jae, and the message was delivered without a word being spoken. Ethan's face cycled through protest and calculation and resignation in about 3 seconds, and then he straightened his jacket with the mechanical dignity of a man swallowing something humiliating, and he walked toward the elevator. Anya watched him go. She had loved him once, or she'd believed she had, which she'd since decided was the same wound with a different name. 3 years. An engagement. She'd worn his ring for 14 months before she found the other woman. Or rather, before the other woman found her, which was worse. She'd learned things about Ethan in that conversation that had rearranged her understanding of the previous 3 years the way an earthquake rearranges a room. Suddenly, all the furniture was in the wrong place, and it was unclear whether the structure itself was still sound. She'd given the ring back on a Wednesday. She hadn't spoken to him in 11 months. And then Lily got sick, and Anya's savings lasted 6 months, and she sold her Chicago apartment, and the experimental treatment program was extraordinary and effective and completely beyond reach financially, and somehow, Ethan had reappeared with his hands open and his smile performing warmth it didn't feel, and she had been exhausted enough and desperate enough and running low enough on alternatives that she'd let herself believe the helpful version of him might be real. She understood the mistake now. The elevator closed behind him. Anya turned back to Min-jae and found him still watching her with that quality of attention that made her feel simultaneously seen and threatened in ways she couldn't separate from each other. Sit down, he said. I'd rather stand. Something moved through his expression, not irritation, something closer to the opposite. Suit yourself. He picked up the whiskey glass and looked at it. What's in the invoice? She blinked. What? The paper you've been gripping since you walked in here. The one you folded and unfolded so many times it's starting to come apart at the seams. He set the glass down. What's in it? Anya looked down at her hands. She hadn't realized she'd been doing that, working the invoice between her fingers the way other people worry rosary beads or rubber bands. The paper was warm from her hands and slightly damp from the rain that had soaked through her coat. She crossed the room and placed it on the table in front of him. Min-jae didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at it first, then at her, then he unfolded it with deliberate care and read it. His expression didn't change. The numbers were staggering, she knew that. She'd stared at them for weeks. The experimental treatment program, the specialist team, the facility costs, the follow-up protocols, the total that sat at the bottom of the page like a sentence handed down by a judge who wasn't interested in appeals. 1 million, $200,000. Approximate. Subject to treatment timeline adjustments. He folded it back along its existing creases and placed it on the table. Your sister, he said. Lily. She's 24. Anya's voice stayed level through an act of will that she felt in her chest wall. Rare autoimmune condition. The treatment exists. It works. There are 2 documented cases of full recovery in patients with her specific presentation. The program has an 83% efficacy rate when treatment begins before significant organ involvement. She paused. She has maybe 2 weeks before the window closes. Min-jae was quiet for a moment. And you burned through your own resources. Everything I had, sold my apartment, worked overtime until my hands shook through sutures, and my supervisor threatened to pull my license if I didn't sleep. Applied for every grant and foundation funding program I could find. The answer was always either no or not fast enough. The words were coming out flat, factual, stripped of the emotion she'd learned to suppress in trauma bays when the only useful version of herself was the technical one. I need $1 million to save my sister's life. The room was very quiet. Min-jae looked at her for a long time. The jazz moved through the air between them. What happens, he said quietly, if you don't get it? Anya swallowed. Her throat tightened. She dies. Min-jae set down the whiskey glass. He leaned back in his chair, and for a long moment his expression was unreadable in the amber light. Not blank, not absent, just closed. Whatever was happening behind it folded back out of view, the way a surgeon's hands go still above an open chest, while the surgeon's mind moves very fast. Then he said, "What do you know about me?" She'd known this question was coming. She'd been preparing for it since the elevator ride down, running through the fragments Ethan had offered on the drive over between his sales pitch reassurances, organizing them into something coherent. Kang Min-jae, she said, your family has operated in Seoul's private economy for 3 generations. You took over 7 years ago after your father's death under circumstances that were never publicly clarified. You have a legitimate holding company, Kang Capital, that functions as the surface layer of something considerably larger. You're 34. You're not married. You're described in certain circles as untouchable, which I assume means the people who've tried to move against you have not fared well. Min-jae's mouth didn't move. And you showed up here anyway. My sister is dying. The words landed in the quiet, simple, final, the kind of sentence that had no argument beneath it. Something shifted in Min-jae's expression again. That fractional movement she couldn't quite read. Something that looked almost like recognition, like a man encountering a specific kind of pain he'd seen before in the mirror. He stood. He was taller than she'd registered from across the room. Not enormous, but present in a way that the space around him adjusted for. The way a room adjusts for something with its own gravitational weight. He picked up the invoice from the table and looked at it again briefly, then set it down. There's a situation, he said. I assumed. A Japanese syndicate. Family called Sato. They've been pushing for a political alliance through marriage for 8 months. If I refuse, the conflict that follows will be expensive. Significant. He paused. Bloody. Anya kept her face neutral. Her heart was doing something complicated. And if you're already married, she said, before they can formalize the demand, the leverage disappears. You need a wife. I need a specific kind of wife, he said. Credible, intelligent, someone who can hold a room without falling apart, someone who cannot be bought or frightened easily. He looked at her steadily. You've been standing in a room full of armed men for 20 minutes, and the only thing you've shown is irritation. I'm terrified, Anya said. I'm just better at terrified than most people. The corner of his mouth moved, just slightly, gone before she could decide what it meant. 1 year, he said. Marriage in name. Appearances when necessary. You'll have security, resources, and full access to medical care for your sister beginning within 24 hours of the agreement. He paused. At the end of the year, you walk away with the $1 million. The arrangement dissolves cleanly. No further obligations. Anya looked at him. The rational part of her brain, the part that had kept her alive through 4 years of emergency medicine, through medical school, through all of it, was performing a rapid triage the way it always did when circumstances were terrible and the options were all bad and something still had to be decided right now. risk assessment, survival calculus. What does refusing this cost against what does accepting it cost? Lily had 2 weeks. I need guarantees, she said. Legal documents. Lily's treatment funded and initiated before I sign anything else. A clear exit structure. My professional life stays intact. I keep working, I keep my license, I maintain my own identity in every context where it matters. Min-jae studied her. You're negotiating. I'm a trauma surgeon. We don't agree to procedures without knowing the protocol. The slight curve at the corner of his mouth came back and stayed a fraction longer this time. Agreed, he said. The word hit her chest like something physical. She'd expected him to push back, counter, demand more, strip the terms down to something worse. That was how these things worked. That was how powerful men worked. She'd always understood it that way. The slow removal of leverage until the other person had nothing left to protect. Instead, he'd simply agreed. Why? She said. Why what? Why me? You have resources I can't comprehend. You could manufacture a more convenient solution. Min-jae was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with that quality of attention that she was starting to think she'd never quite get used to. Convenient solutions are forgettable, he said. The Sato family isn't stupid. They'll verify the marriage is real. That means it needs to look real. He paused. You look real. She wasn't sure she understood that completely. She wasn't sure she was meant to. She reached for the invoice and folded it one more time. The paper gave along its worn seams. If anything happens to my sister because of this arrangement, she said, no agreement, no contract, and no number of armed men in this room will protect you from me. The room was very still. Min-jae held her gaze. I believe you, he said. And the terrifying thing, the thing she turned over in her mind all the way through the cold elevator ride back up and through the black car that took her across Seoul to her hospital apartment, and through the 3 hours she spent sitting on the edge of her bed staring at the city lights before she finally admitted she wasn't sleeping, was that he'd meant it. The wedding took place 72 hours later. Not because Anya had stopped having doubts. She'd had nothing but doubts, an unrelenting cascade of them, every hour between agreement and ceremony producing new specific varieties of terror she hadn't anticipated. She'd sat across from Min-jae's attorney in a glass-walled conference room and read every line of the contract twice, made 3 modifications, and forced the attorney to redraft 2 clauses, and signed her name at the bottom with the same mechanical steadiness she used to sign surgical consent forms when she was exhausted and the stakes were too high for her hand to shake. She signed because 23 hours after the agreement, Lily's treatment was confirmed and funded and underway. She'd stood in the ICU hallway and watched through the window while the specialist team began the first protocol infusion, and she'd pressed her forehead against the cold glass and felt something release in her chest that had been locked down for 6 months. Some compressed tectonic pressure that had been building since the day the diagnosis arrived, and she'd understood what it was going to cost and started calculating. Lily was going to live. The rest of it, the contract, the man, the impossible situation, was the price of that. She wore white to the wedding because she refused to dress like anything other than herself regardless of the circumstances, and she'd be damned if she was going to show up in something that looked like defeat. The gown was simple, clean lines, no embellishment, the kind of dress that existed to be worn by a person who had already decided what they were doing and didn't need the fabric to make that statement for them. Min-jae wore black. The space was a private hall overlooking the Han River. No guests. His attorney, 2 witnesses whose names she didn't learn, and 4 security personnel stationed at the doors. The ceremony took 11 minutes. The officiant moved through the words with professional efficiency, and Anya stood opposite Min-jae under the indifferent light and held his gaze and said the required words in a voice that didn't crack. When it was done, Min-jae's hand settled against the small of her back. 3 seconds. Just 3. A barely there pressure, the most minimal version of the gesture, nothing that should have registered. It registered. She felt it through her spine like a current, warm and startling, and she spent the next hour being furious at herself for that reaction, because she was a rational adult who had entered a business arrangement, and she was absolutely not going to. She wasn't going to. She pushed it down and kept her face still, and shook the attorney's hand and got into the car. The mansion sat on a hill in the northern part of the city, wrapped in steel gates and surveillance infrastructure that she cataloged automatically because cataloging things was how she moved through unfamiliar and threatening environments. The interior was enormous and minimal. Dark marble floors, high ceilings, clean architectural lines, the kind of space designed to communicate power through restraint rather than excess. It was cold in the way that beautiful things are sometimes cold, technically perfect and somehow starved of comfort. A woman named Mrs. Cho, who was about 60 and had the particular demeanor of someone who had witnessed everything and judged nothing, showed Anya to her rooms. Sweet, really. Her own bedroom, bathroom, sitting room. Separate from Minji's wing entirely. Her bags had been transferred from her hospital apartment with a thoroughness that made her feel vaguely surveilled, even though she understood it was just logistics. She stood in the bedroom and looked at the city spread below the hill and told herself this was a transaction, a contract. 11 months and 3 weeks remained. She would be professional and appropriate and contained, and she would fulfill the terms of the arrangement, and then she would take her $1 million and her sister and reconstruct her life on the other side of this, and that would be that. She said this very clearly to herself. Then she turned around and Min Jae was in the doorway. Not close. He hadn't crossed the threshold. He leaned against the frame with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbows, holding a glass of water which he extended toward her. "You haven't had anything since this morning," he said. She stared at him. "Mrs. Cho keeps inventory," he said, without particular expression. "It's her version of caring about people." Anya crossed the room and took the glass. Their fingers didn't touch. She drank half of it and looked out the window. "Ground rules?" she said. "All right. You don't enter my rooms without knocking. I don't enter yours without the same. In public, we perform whatever the arrangement requires. In private, we're two people sharing a space with a contract between us. No pretense, no performance, no obligation beyond what we agreed." Min Jae was quiet for a moment. "Agreed," he said. "I keep working. My schedule at the hospital doesn't change." "Understood. And I need to see Lily every day for the first 2 weeks of the treatment protocol. After that, twice a week minimum. A car will be available to you whenever you want one." He paused. "I'll have a security detail assigned. You'll barely notice them." "I'll be very annoyed by them," she said flatly. "Yes," he agreed, and something in his voice suggested he found this mildly acceptable, which she decided to be irritated by later when she had more bandwidth. He pushed off the doorframe. "Get some sleep," he said. "You've been awake for—" 31 hours, she said. "I know. I'm fine." He looked at her for a moment, that quality of attention again. Steady, undiluted, the gaze of a man who looked at things directly and didn't look away from what he found. "You're not fine," he said, "but you're functional. That's a different thing." He left. She stood in the room with the half-empty water glass and the city lights below, and the strange, compressed silence of a house full of people who moved carefully, and she turned the day over in her mind. The casino, the contract, the 11-minute ceremony, the 3 seconds of his hand against her back, and somewhere between one thought and the next, she sat down on the edge of the unfamiliar bed and felt the 31 hours settle over her like weight. She meant to stay awake. She was asleep in 4 minutes. She dreamed of her sister's hands, small and warm, the way they'd felt when Lily was 7 and used to reach for her in the dark when something scared her. In the dream, Anya reached back. In the dream, her hands were steady. She woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of rain and a faint light coming from somewhere down the hall, and without deciding to, she got up and followed it. The balcony doors at the end of the corridor were open. Min Jae stood outside with his back to her, looking at the city below. He'd changed into a white shirt, the cuffs rolled, and something about his posture was different from the controlled, compressed stillness he wore in public. His shoulders were looser, his head was angled slightly down. He looked like a man alone in the particular way that people look alone when they've been alone for a very long time and have stopped expecting it to change. Anya almost went back. Then she saw the stain on his cuff. Dark. Spreading. She was moving before she fully processed it, barefoot on the cold marble, stopping behind him with 2 feet of rain-cold air between them. "You're hurt." He turned. His expression shifted back toward neutral almost instantaneously, but she'd caught the fraction of a second before the mask reassembled. And what she saw there was not pain exactly. It was something older and more complicated, the look of a person for whom being hurt is so common it doesn't register as notable. "It isn't mine," he said. The rational part of her brain cataloged the implications of that sentence and filed them somewhere she'd deal with later. The doctor part of her brain moved his arm into the light and pushed the cuff back and found the knife wound. Clean, maybe 3 inches, deep enough to need closing, but not threatening anything structural. "Sit down," she said. "It doesn't—" "I'm a trauma surgeon," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She found a first aid kit in the kitchen that was comprehensive enough to suggest someone in this household required medical attention with regularity, which told her something she absorbed without comment. She worked in the low light of the kitchen with rain hammering the windows, and Min Jae sat shirtless on the kitchen counter and was absolutely silent while she cleaned and closed the wound with the particular focused efficiency that 15-hour shifts had made automatic in her. The scars were worse than she'd expected, not scattered, accumulated. A history written across his body in blade work and ballistic trauma and things that had healed wrong and been re-injured. She identified the stories by the shapes of them. The elongated keloid on his left side that said blade, entry, and exit. The circular impression below his right shoulder that said small caliber. The silver-white network across his forearm that said fire. She didn't say any of this aloud. It wasn't her history to read out loud, but her hands noted each one as they moved, and she understood by the end of it that whatever she'd thought she was entering into when she signed that contract, she'd underestimated the violence at its center. "You're staring," he said. "I'm assessing." "Same thing." "No," she said. "One is professional." He was quiet for a moment. She tied off the last closure and sat back and looked at her work. "You always stare at injuries this intensely?" he asked. His voice was low, not unfriendly, different from the controlled public register, slightly more worn at the edges. "I'm trying to understand how you're still alive," she said honestly. Something shifted in his expression. His dark eyes moved to her face. "I was about to ask you the same thing," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Rain moved across the windows. The city spread out below them, glittering and indifferent, and Anya became suddenly and uncomfortably aware of the fact that she was sitting 18 inches from a man she'd married 11 hours ago and barely knew and was treating in her bare feet in a kitchen in the middle of the night, and that the awareness she felt of him, physical, specific, unwanted, was considerably stronger than any rational assessment of the situation permitted. She packed the first aid kit. She stood up. "Don't let it get infected," she said, and her voice came out professional and level, and she considered that a genuine achievement under the circumstances. She walked back to her room. She did not think about the look in his eyes when he'd said it. She told herself she didn't. The following week settled into a pattern that was strange and tightly wound and bristling with a tension she refused to name. She went to the hospital. She worked her shifts, long ones, the kind that left her hollowed out and purposeful at the same time. She visited Lily, who was responding to the treatment with a speed that made the specialist team guarded and optimistic in equal measure. She came home to the mansion and moved through its cold, beautiful spaces and ate dinners that appeared in the kitchen with regularity and never required explanation, and sometimes Min Jae was there and sometimes he wasn't. When he was there, the house was different. She noticed that. Not noisier. The opposite, if anything. He was a quiet person, economical with words, not inclined toward small talk or performance. But there was a quality to his presence, a kind of density, that changed the weight of the rooms he occupied. She'd find him reading in the study, or standing on the balcony with a glass of something he wasn't drinking, or working at his desk at hours that suggested he rarely slept. And every time she moved through a space he was in, she felt the adjustment her body made to his proximity and was annoyed by it with a thoroughness that told her something she wasn't ready to look at directly. He kept the rules. Precisely. He knocked. He didn't enter her spaces uninvited. In public, at the 2 formal dinners and the business event Mrs. Cho prepared her for during those weeks, he was everything the arrangement required. Attentive, credible, the convincing performance of a man who had chosen this woman deliberately, his hand at her back, his attention on her face when she spoke, the way he positioned himself when other men were too close that wasn't possessive, exactly, but was something adjacent to it that she absolutely was not supposed to find steadying. She found it steadying. She was working on being furious at herself about that when the message came. 3 weeks into the arrangement, a Tuesday. She was reviewing patient charts in the hospital break room at 11 p.m. when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She answered. Static. Then a voice she didn't know. Flat, precise, with an accent that blended Japanese and American in a way that felt deliberate. Dr. Carter, the voice said. Or I suppose it's Mrs. Kang now. Her hand tightened on the phone. I'm going to need you to listen very carefully, the voice said, because what happens in the next 48 hours is going to depend entirely on the choices you make. And I think you should know, before you make them, that we've been watching your sister's treatment progress with considerable interest. The break room was very cold. Who is this? Anya said. Someone who was very unhappy, the voice said pleasantly, to receive a wedding announcement. The line went dead. Anya sat in the break room for 60 seconds. Her hands were not shaking. That was the thing about years of emergency medicine. It didn't make you fearless. It just made you faster than the fear, so that by the time the fear caught up with you, the work was already done. She called Min-jae. He answered on the second ring. I just got a call, she said. Someone who knows about Lily's treatment, someone who's unhappy about the wedding. A pause. Short. Are you at the hospital? Yes. Stay there, he said. Don't leave the building. I'll have someone with you in 8 minutes. Min-jae? 8 minutes, he said. His voice had changed, not louder. Something more fundamental, flattened out, compressed, stripped down to pure information and the cold efficiency of a man who had done terrible things before and was calculating whether he was about to do them again. Who are they? She said. A pause. People I hoped wouldn't move this quickly, he said. Then, I'm sorry I brought you into this. She'd never heard him apologize for anything. The call ended. Anya put the phone down on the break room table and looked at the door and thought about the invoice she'd been carrying for weeks, soft at the folds, and Lily's hands through the ICU glass, and the 3 seconds of warmth against the small of her back that she'd been trying to forget ever since. 8 minutes. She waited. The 8 minutes felt like 40. Anya sat in the break room with her hands flat on the table and the overhead fluorescent light, doing what fluorescent lights always did in hospitals at midnight, stripping everything down to its ugliest essential truth. No shadows, no softness, just the hard geometry of things as they actually were. The coffee in the machine across the room had been sitting since the 7 o'clock shift change and smelled burnt and wrong. Someone had left a sandwich wrapper on the counter. The clock on the wall made a small tick every 60 seconds that she'd never noticed before tonight, and now couldn't stop hearing. She ran through it methodically because that was what she did when she was scared. The voice on the phone had known her name. Both names, Carter and Kang. Had known about Lily's treatment specifically, not just the marriage, which meant either surveillance of the hospital or a source inside Min-jae's network or both. Had called her directly, which meant they had her number, which meant they'd been watching her longer than tonight. The Sato family. Min-jae had named them in the casino, the Japanese syndicate pushing for the political marriage alliance. She'd filed it away as context, something that explained the shape of the arrangement without necessarily touching her directly. She understood now that she'd been wrong about that. A knock on the break room door, 2 quick controlled raps. And then a man she'd seen twice at the mansion stepped in. Mid-30s, Korean. Built with the particular compacted density of someone who'd been trained rather than gym sculpted. He introduced himself as Park and did not offer a last name or a title or any additional information, and his eyes swept the room in a single practiced arc before settling on her with the professional neutrality of someone whose job was to keep her alive, and who had already decided to take that seriously. Mr. Kang asked me to stay with you until he arrives, Park said. He's coming here. Yes. She nodded once and looked back at the table and said nothing else. Park positioned himself near the door and went quiet in the way that trained security people go quiet, not absent, not relaxed, but held in a specific state of readiness that she'd started to recognize over the past 3 weeks. The human equivalent of a system running at low idle with the emergency protocols 2 keystrokes from active. Min-jae arrived in 6 minutes, not 8. He came through the break room door still buttoning his jacket, which told her he'd moved fast enough that normal preparation had been compressed. His hair was slightly off, not disheveled exactly, just not the architectural perfection it was in public. His eyes found her immediately and ran the same assessment Park had performed on the room, except when his eyes reached her face, they stayed there for a moment longer. "You're all right," he said. Not a question, verification. "I'm fine," she paused. "Who called me?" He sat down across from her, not the controlled, managed movement he used in public. This was direct, purposeful. He leaned his forearms on the table. "We're not having this conversation here. We're having it somewhere." "Yes," he said, "but not here." The drive back to the mansion was 22 minutes through streets that were wet and nearly empty, the city's nighttime skeleton stripped of its daytime performance. Min-jae sat beside her in the back seat and looked out the window and said nothing. And Anya looked at his reflection in the glass and thought about the voice on the phone, flat, pleasant, precise, and the specific way it had said your sister's treatment progress like it was reading from a file, like Lily's life was a piece of information it had acquired and was simply choosing, for now, to hold rather than use. The fury arrived slowly, the way real fury did, not explosive, not loud, but dense and cold and settling in her chest like ballast. By the time they reached the mansion, she had it contained. Min-jae led her to the study, which she'd seen through the door twice but never entered. Dark wood, floor-to-ceiling shelves, a desk that was covered in documents, and a laptop and a controlled disorder that was the only room in the house that looked like someone actually lived in it. He closed the door. He didn't sit. "Victor Sato," he said. 49 years old, second generation. His father built the Sato Syndicate's international operations. Victor inherited them 8 years ago and has been expanding aggressively since. He's been attempting to formalize a merger with the Kang network for 2 years through a marriage alliance. When I declined the first approach, he escalated. The second approach was more direct. When I declined again, he paused. He became creative. How creative? 3 incidents in the past 4 months. One was a message, one was a demonstration. The third was... He stopped. Something moved across his expression, brief and dark. A person I employed. They were returned to me in a condition that was intended to communicate a specific point. Anya held his gaze, and the point was that he would dismantle everything I value until I agreed to his terms. So he found out about me. He found out about the marriage within 12 hours of the ceremony. My network has a leak. I've been working to identify it. He's been watching you since then, and he called me tonight to... What? Warn me? Threaten me? Both. Min-jae's jaw tightened slightly. He's communicating that you're not protected, that the marriage doesn't make you untouchable, that if I continue to refuse the alliance, the pressure will come through you. The room was quiet. Anya let the information sit for a moment, turning it over, looking at its angles the way she looked at a complex injury. Where is the damage? What is at risk? What can be saved? And in what order? He mentioned Lily's treatment specifically, she said. Min-jae looked at her. She watched his expression and saw the answer before he said it. "Yes," he said. "I know." What does that mean, practically speaking? Can he interfere with the treatment? He can attempt to. Min-jae's voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone very hard. "I've already made calls tonight. The facility will have additional security by morning. Lily's treatment team has been briefed, not on specifics, on protocol." "You did that in the car?" "Yes." She exhaled slowly through her nose. "You should have told me about Sato before the wedding," she said. The words landed cleanly in the quiet. Min-jae didn't flinch from them. "Yes," he said. "I signed a contract based on incomplete information." "Yes. That's..." She stopped herself. Her hands were flat on the arms of the chair she'd sat in, and she made herself keep them still. "That was deliberate. You calculated that if you told me the full scope of what I was walking into, I'd refuse." He didn't answer, which was an answer. "Would you have?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. The fury was still there, cold and dense, and beneath it something more complicated. The recognition that the calculation he'd made wasn't wrong, that she might have refused, that if she'd refused, Lily would have 2 weeks of life left and counting. I don't know, she said honestly. And that's not the point. The point is that it was my choice to make with full information, and you removed that. Min Jae was quiet. He looked at her steadily. You're right, he said. She hadn't expected that either. He kept doing that, agreeing with things she expected him to deflect from, acknowledging things she expected him to defend. It was disorienting in a way she didn't have language for yet. What happens now, she said. We tighten security across all points. I accelerate the search for the network leak, and we continue the arrangement publicly without any visible change. Because the moment Sato believes he's rattled the situation, he'll escalate. So I go to work tomorrow morning and behave normally. Yes. While someone who knows where my sister is being treated has made an implicit threat against her life. Yes. His voice didn't soften it. She found she preferred that. The directness, the refusal to wrap the terrible thing in language that made it smaller. I won't pretend the situation isn't serious. It is. But I will also tell you that I have significant resources and considerable motivation to keep you and your sister safe, and I intend to use both. Anya looked at him. Why considerable motivation, she said. Contractually speaking, I'm a transaction. Something moved through his expression. That fractional shift she still couldn't read precisely. Contractually speaking, he said carefully. Yes. She let that sit without examining it. She stood up. I need to sleep, she said. I'm back at the hospital at 7. Anya. She stopped at the door, turned. Min Jae was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Not the controlled public mask, not the stripped-down directness of their private conversations, but something in between and underneath both of them, something that looked like it cost him something to let be visible. I am sorry, he said, for what I didn't tell you. She held his gaze for a moment. I know, she said. She went to bed. She didn't sleep. The next 48 hours were a performance she gave herself completely to, because the alternative was to stand still and feel the ground moving underneath her, and she'd learned long ago that motion was better than stillness when the situation was dangerous. She worked her hospital shifts with the focused precision that had always been her best defense against everything outside the operating room. The work was real, the work was solvable, the work responded to skill and attention in ways that the rest of her life currently did not. She visited Lily on the second afternoon. Her sister was sitting up in bed, which was new. 2 weeks earlier, Lily had been unable to hold her own weight. Now she was sitting up with a tablet in her lap and a cup of tea on the bedside table, and a look of deliberate studied casualness that meant she was preparing to ask about something she'd already decided Anya wouldn't want to discuss. You look terrible, Lily said. You look significantly better than the last time I saw you. The tea here is unacceptable, but everything else is extraordinary. Lily set the tablet down. Who are these doctors? Why do they keep checking my inflammatory markers every 4 hours? Why is there a man outside my door who is built like a refrigerator and smiles at me every time I look at him? His name is Park, Anya said. He's security. Security. Lily's eyes sharpened. She'd always been quicker than people expected because she had the kind of face that people read as soft and the kind of mind that made use of being underestimated. Security for what? Anya, what's going on? Anya sat down in the chair beside the bed. She'd prepared for this conversation during the commute, running through the versions of it, the amount of truth that was protective versus the amount that was simply transferring fear from one person to another. Lily was 24 and recovering from something that had nearly killed her, and was currently confined to a hospital bed and couldn't do anything with the full truth except lie awake at night carrying it. There are some business complications with the funding arrangement, Anya said. Precautionary security is standard protocol. Lily looked at her for a long moment. You're lying to me. I'm simplifying. That is the same thing with better branding. Lily reached out and grabbed Anya's hand. Her grip was weaker than it had been before the illness. The treatment was working, but rebuilding took time, and sometimes Anya's chest ached with the gap between who Lily had been physically 6 months ago and who she was in this bed right now. "Tell me what's actually happening." Anya looked at their hands. "I married someone," she said. The silence that followed was very complete. "I'm sorry," Lily said. "You did what?" "It was a financial arrangement. He funded your treatment in exchange for... It's complicated. It's a contract, a legal agreement." She paused. "His name is Kang Min Jae, the person whose money is paying for all of this." "Yes." "And you married him?" "Yes." Lily stared at her. "Anya Mae Carter," she said, in the specific register that meant she was using the full name as punctuation for how serious she was being. "Are you in a safe situation?" "Yes." The word came out immediate, and then she sat with it for a moment and was faintly surprised to realize she meant it. "Yes, I am." "You're sure?" "He's..." She stopped. Tried again. "The situation has complications that I didn't fully anticipate, but he's not the danger." Lily's eyes moved over her face with the particular attention of a younger sister who had spent a lifetime learning to read her older sister's specific varieties of self-protective concealment. "You like him," Lily said. "That's not what this is." "You like him, and that scares you more than the complications." "Lily, I'm in a hospital bed, I'm bored, and I've known you for 24 years, Lily said. "Don't try to misdirect me." Anya looked at the window. Seoul spread out beyond it in the afternoon light, the city doing what it always did, moving, glittering, indifferent, enormous, eating lives and producing beauty, and making no promises about which it would give you on any given day. "Get some rest," she said. Lily squeezed her hand once, hard, and let go. Anya drove back to the mansion in the security car with Park silent in the front seat and the city moving past the windows, and she thought about Min Jae's face in the study 2 nights ago. The thing that had been visible for those few seconds, the thing that looked like it cost him something. And she pressed the thought down and looked out the window and concentrated on the traffic. The event that changed things happened on the 9th day. It was a dinner. A business dinner, 12 people around a table at a private venue in Itaewon, the kind of gathering that was formally about investment strategy and informally about the performance of power. Everyone present demonstrating through presence and manner and the way they occupied their chairs, the specific size of their authority. Anya had attended 2 events like this in the past weeks and understood the choreography by now. She wore what Mrs. Cho quietly suggested with an efficiency that had stopped feeling like intrusion and started feeling like a particular kind of care. She sat beside Min Jae and performed the role with the focused precision she brought to any technical task, and told herself it was simply a different kind of work. The problem was a man named Choi Dae-won. He was seated 3 places down, late 50s, property development money, the kind of man who had decided his wealth entitled him to a specific relationship with the women in any room he entered. He'd looked at Anya across the table during the appetizer course in a way that she'd cataloged and filed under manageable and moved past. By the main course, he'd made 2 comments directed at her that sailed just underneath the altitude of obvious rudeness, close enough to the line that calling them out directly would look like overreaction. She handled it. Deflected cleanly, held her ground without escalating, moved the conversation away from him. Min Jae had heard everything. She could tell by the shift in his posture, subtle, the same compression she'd come to recognize as his version of controlled anger, the way he went slightly more still when something was wrong. He said nothing. He didn't look at Choi. He simply changed the angle of his body slightly so that he was oriented more toward Anya than before, and his hand moved from the table to the back of her chair, not touching her, just present, a few centimeters behind her shoulders. Choi made a 3rd comment during dessert, something about the interesting choices that doctors made when they expanded their career portfolios. The table went slightly quiet, and Min Jae, without looking at Choi, without raising his voice or adjusting his expression by more than a fraction, said, "I'd encourage you to find a different direction for the rest of the evening." The way he said it was not a suggestion. Choi found a different direction immediately. The dinner ended with the usual rituals of departure, and in the car afterward, Anya sat beside Min Jae and felt the warmth of the evening still moving through her chest, complex and unwanted and specific, and she looked out the window and said nothing for a long time. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "I was handling it." "I know. Then why?" "Because I wanted to," he said. His voice was quiet and level and completely direct. "And because I was tired of watching him." She turned to look at him. He was looking out his own window, jaw set, the city's light moving across his face. He looked tired, she thought. Not physically, or not only physically, but in the deeper way that people look tired when they've been carrying something heavy for a long time, and the weight has settled so thoroughly into the way they hold themselves that they can't remember their posture before it. She thought about the scars, the accumulated evidence of a violent life worn quietly under expensive fabric, the 3 a.m. balcony. The way he'd said, "I was about to ask you the same thing," and looked at her like he meant something by it that neither of them was ready to name. She looked back out her window. They didn't speak again until the mansion, but when they reached the front entrance and Min-jae held the door and she passed close enough to him that she could feel the warmth off his arm, she said, "Thank you." He didn't say "you're welcome." He looked at her, and the quality of attention was different from all the previous times. Less contained, something underneath it that had moved closer to the surface, something that was running out of room. "Anya," he said. She should have gone inside. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He stepped back. His expression closed, managed, returned to its careful calibration. "Good night." She went inside. She stood in her sitting room for a long time doing nothing. The call that broke everything came 4 days later. She was between patients when her phone rang. Hospital number, internal extension, the kind of call that meant something clinical. She answered automatically. It was the specialist leading Lily's treatment. His voice was careful in the way that doctors' voices went careful when information was serious, and they were assembling the words to deliver it without causing damage they didn't intend. "Dr. Carter," he said, "I need you to come to the facility." Her blood went cold. "What's happened?" "Miss Carter is stable," he said quickly, and she exhaled the breath she'd been holding like a fist. "She's stable, but there's been an incident related to the treatment protocols. I think you need to be here for this conversation." She was in a car in 8 minutes. Park drove with the particular efficiency of someone who understood that this was not a normal commute, and Anya sat in the back and watched the city move past and kept her breathing steady and thought of nothing. She reached the facility in 17 minutes. The specialist met her outside Lily's room. He was a careful man, mid-50s, precise, the kind of doctor who delivered information in structured sequences because he understood that how you said terrible things mattered almost as much as what you were saying. He told her, in a sequence that she followed with the detached clinical focus she'd trained for years to access under pressure, that the treatment had encountered a complication. Not in Lily, in the protocol itself. A supply component, a specific compound that was administered in conjunction with the primary treatment, had been delayed, indefinitely. The supplier had flagged a regulatory hold that had come through 24 hours ago, blocking the shipment. The complication was that without the compound, the primary treatment's efficacy dropped significantly, enough to change the recovery projection. "How significantly?" Anya said. The specialist told her. She stood in the corridor and held the information. "Is this a standard regulatory issue?" she asked. Her voice was flat and precise. "Or is it something else?" The specialist looked at her carefully. "The regulatory hold was filed through a subsidiary company based in Tokyo," he said. "I don't know if that's relevant." Anya looked at the closed door to Lily's room. "It's relevant," she said. She called Min-jae. He answered on the first ring. "They interfered with Lily's treatment compound," she said. "A regulatory hold through a Tokyo subsidiary. The specialist says without the compound, the efficacy of the primary treatment drops enough to change the recovery projection." She paused. "This was Sato." Silence on the line. Short, dense. "Yes," Min-jae said. "He's moving Lily," she said. Not a question. The logic was clean and terrible. The phone call warning, the surveillance. Now this. Not a direct threat, something more precise, a demonstration of access, a proof of concept. I can reach the things you love through channels you didn't know existed. He's sending a message, Minjae said. He sent it. Her voice came out controlled and hard. What does he want? The files, Minjae said. Documentation of my network's operations. Names, accounts, transaction records. Everything he needs to absorb the Kang operations and fold them into the Sato syndicate without resistance. A pause. With those files, he controls not just my assets, but my leverage over every party who's ever done business with me. It would functionally end independent operation. And if you give them to him, Minjae was quiet. Then everything I've spent 7 years building becomes part of his organization. The people who work for me, who trusted me, become his. The violence he's been managed not to commit because of the balance of power we maintain becomes possible. Another pause, and his voice when it came back was stripped down to something raw and undefended. Some of them would die, Anya, people I'm responsible for. She stood in the corridor. So the choice, she said, is your people or my sister. That is what he wants you to believe it is, Minjae said. I don't accept that framing. Then what's the actual framing? That he's made a move that requires a response, and that I need 12 hours to construct one. His voice was steady and specific. Go to Lily. Stay with her tonight. Don't leave the facility. I will fix this. Minjae, I need you to trust me, he said. The corridor was quiet. The clinical lights above her did what clinical lights did, stripped everything to its essential form. She thought about the contract, the invoice, the 3 a.m. kitchen, the dinner table, and his voice saying, find a different direction, like he was simply clarifying a fact of the universe. 12 hours, she said. Yes. She went into Lily's room. Lily was awake, sitting up, her face carrying the particular careful neutrality of someone who had already intuited that the situation was serious and was deciding how much to ask. She looked at Anya. Anya sat down beside her bed and took her sister's hand and held it without saying anything, and Lily let her, and outside the window Seoul moved through its evening without slowing down. The 12 hours passed. Minjae called her at 6 a.m. The regulatory hold has been lifted, he said. The compound will arrive at the facility by noon. A pause. The supplier's Tokyo contact experienced a significant and sudden loss of motivation to maintain the hold. She exhaled. How? She said. I found our network leak, he said. It was someone close. Someone I trusted for years. His voice didn't change register, but something in its texture shifted. Not grief exactly, but something adjacent. The sound of a person absorbing something that hurt in a way they'd decided not to perform. He'd been feeding Sato information for 8 months. The supply interference was coordinated through him. What happened to him? A pause. He's been removed from the situation, Minjae said. She understood what that meant. She held the understanding for a moment, examined it, decided what she was going to do with it. She wasn't going to ask. The Sato problem, she said. This resolves it? No, Minjae said. It changes his position. He's lost his inside access, which changes his options. But Victor Sato does not... He stopped. She heard something in the silence. A recalibration. He doesn't respond to setbacks with retreat. He responds with escalation. Meaning I've bought time and closed a breach, but the larger problem is still ahead of us. She was quiet for a moment. Minjae, she said. Yes. When you found the leak, was that... She stopped, tried again. Was there a moment where giving Sato what he wanted seemed like the simpler answer? The pause was longer this time. Yes, he said. But you didn't. No. She stood at the window of Lily's room, looking at Seoul coming into morning, the light arriving at the angle it always arrived at this time of day, sliding between buildings, hitting the Han River in the distance so that it briefly appeared to be on fire. Come get me, she said. We need to talk about what comes next. She heard him exhale. Not with relief exactly, with something more complicated. The sound of a man who had been holding a great deal of weight alone for a very long time and had just been told he didn't have to. I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. She stayed at the window. The city moved below her, enormous and indifferent and alive. And somewhere in the wiring of the Sato network, something was already moving in response. Patient, precise, and building toward the moment when Victor Sato would stop sending messages and simply act. And the war that had been conducted through proxies and supply chains and phone calls in empty hospital break rooms would become something else entirely. Something that couldn't be managed from behind the safety of walls and contracts and careful 12-hour responses. Something that would require both of them to step forward into the open with nothing between them and what was coming. She didn't know that yet, but Min-jae did. And when he arrived at the facility 22 minutes later and she met him in the lobby and saw his face, not the public mask, not the stripped-down directness of their private conversations, but something underneath both. Something that looked directly at her with a weight that had nothing to do with the contract or the arrangement or the careful rules they'd built between themselves. She understood that something had shifted in the hours while she'd been holding her sister's hand in a hospital room, something that neither of them was going to be able to manage back into the shape it had been before. He crossed the lobby and stopped in front of her. "Lily?" he said. "She'll be fine when the compound arrives." Anya looked at him. "What aren't you telling me?" His jaw tightened. "Sato has moved people into Seoul," he said quietly. "Last night. 12 that we've identified. Possibly more." He paused. "He's not sending messages anymore." The lobby was cool and quiet around them. "He's coming," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. He looked back, and the weight between them, all of it. The contract and the arrangement and the careful rules and the 3 a.m. kitchen and the hand on the small of her back and the dinner table and everything they'd both been not saying for weeks, settled into the space between them like something that had finally stopped waiting for. The word that kept coming back to Anya in the hours that followed was permission. Like something had been waiting for permission. Like all the weight between them, weeks of it, accumulated and managed and pressed down into the narrow space of professional arrangement and careful rules, had been standing outside a door they'd both been pretending not to see, and the moment Min-jae said he's coming and looked at her with that undefended expression, the door had simply opened. Not romantically. Nothing that clean. It was more like a collapse. The specific structural failure of a wall that had been load-bearing for too long. She looked at him in the facility lobby and understood several things simultaneously, the way she understood multiple injury vectors during a complex trauma. Not sequentially, but all at once. The whole picture arriving before she'd consciously assembled the pieces. She understood that the contract had become insufficient as a description of what was happening between them. She understood that he knew it too. She understood that neither of them was going to say it out loud in a hospital lobby with Park standing 12 feet away and 12 Sato operatives somewhere in the city moving toward something that hadn't happened yet. "We need a plan," she said. "Yes. A real one. Not protect the asset, not manage the situation." She held his gaze. "If he's moving people in, we need to be ahead of it, not reactive." Min-jae studied her for a moment. "All right," he said. "Come with me." The mansion's lower level contained a room Anya hadn't been shown. It was behind the study, accessed through a door that looked like a wall panel, and inside it was the operational center of whatever Min-jae's legitimate and illegitimate networks actually were in practice. Screens, communication equipment, 3 people she'd never seen before who worked at terminals with the focused silence of specialists, maps of Seoul on 2 of the larger displays with overlaid data she couldn't fully parse. The room smelled like electronics and coffee, and the particular concentrated pressure of people who had been working without adequate sleep. She stood in the doorway and absorbed it. "You've had this here the whole time," she said. "Yes." "Since before I arrived?" "Yes." She filed that. There were things she was going to feel about this room later, when she had bandwidth. The reminder of exactly what kind of man she'd married, the scope of the operation she was embedded in, the specific variety of naivety it had taken for her to imagine that the arrangement's surface layer was the full depth of it. She'd deal with those feelings when the immediate situation permitted. Right now, she stepped into the room. One of the operators, a woman, late 20s, who looked at Anya with brief assessment and then back at her screen, pulled up a map overlay showing 12 marked positions across the city. The cluster was not random. 3 positions were near the facility where Lily was being treated. 2 were near the hospital where Anya worked. The remaining 7 formed a pattern around the northern hills that took her a moment to read. Around the mansion. "They're positioning," she said. "Yes." Minjae moved to stand beside her, and she was aware again of his proximity, the warmth of it, the specific gravity, and pushed the awareness to the edge of her attention where it couldn't interfere. "They've been moving since approximately 3 a.m. Victor isn't here yet. He'll arrive when the pieces are in place." "What's the timeline?" "Based on the positioning rate." He paused, looking at the operator, who answered without being asked. 18 hours, the operator said. Possibly less if they accelerate the outer ring. Anya looked at the map. 12 marked positions: the facility, the hospital, the mansion. "He's covering every point that matters to you," she said. "Yes." "Which means he knows what matters to you." She turned to look at Minjae directly. "The leak you found, how long had it been active?" 8 months, he said. 8 months of information about your network, your operations, your assets. She paused. Your vulnerabilities. Minjae's jaw tightened. Yes. Was the leak one person? Something moved through his expression, that brief, dark thing she'd seen before. Not grief, something heavier. "I believed so," he said. She caught it, the past tense. "Believed," she said. He looked at her, and she understood before he spoke that the floor was about to move. He crossed to one of the terminals and brought up a file. She moved to look at it. A communication record, encrypted, the kind that took serious capability to recover. Names, dates, transaction notations that she couldn't fully decode but whose structure she could read well enough to understand the scale. "The person I removed was Jung," Minjae said. 7 years with me. He managed logistics for the northern operations and had access to our internal communication architecture. He paused. "What I found when I went through his records tonight was that the information flow it wasn't just passive surveillance. It was active, coordinated. He wasn't passing information to Sato alone." Anya looked at the screen. "Who else?" Minjae was quiet for a moment. "Ethan Graves," he said. The name hit the room. Anya went very still, not surprised. That was the first thing she registered, and the second thing she registered was that the absence of surprise was itself information. Some part of her had known since the casino, since Ethan's nervous laugh, and his hands open and his voice saying this solves both our problems. Had known that his presence in her crisis was not accidental, was not the redemptive reappearance of a man trying to do something good with his connections. She'd known. She'd been too desperate to look at it directly. "Explain," she said. Her voice came out flat and clinical. "Graves has been working with Sato for approximately 14 months, Minjae said. He wasn't softening it. She was grateful for that. His investment banking work gave him access to financial intelligence about individuals under significant financial pressure, people with large medical debts, families in crisis, people who needed money quickly enough that they might make choices they otherwise wouldn't." He paused. "He identified you as a potential candidate through your hospital's financial records, your sister's treatment costs, your depleted assets. He brought you to the casino not as a favor. He was paid to deliver you." The room was very quiet. "He was paid," Anya said. "By Sato. The plan was that a woman in your position, desperate, financially destroyed, facing her sister's death, could be delivered to a situation and manipulated into agreeing to terms that gave Sato leverage over me." Minjae's voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone very hard. "If you'd agreed to Sato's arrangement instead of refusing and coming to me, I would have been under his control," she said. "Yes. And he would have used me to pressure you." "Yes." Anya looked at the communication records on the screen. Ethan had sat across from her in the restaurant where they'd met 6 weeks ago, with his hands open and his voice performing warmth, and he'd said, "I want to help you. I felt terrible about what happened between us. I want to make it right." She had been awake for 22 hours, and Lily's doctors had given her 2 weeks, and she'd looked at him and she'd actually thought, oh, maybe this is real. The fury that arrived was different from the cold, dense anger she'd been managing for weeks. This was hotter, less controlled. It moved through her chest and her arms and her jaw, and she made herself hold it in place through pure physical effort, hands flat against the terminal desk, breathing carefully. "Where is he?" she said. "Seoul," Min-jae said. "He arrived yesterday. He's staying at a private residence in Mapo that we believe is Sato funded. He's here for the escalation." "Yes. I think he's here to witness it, possibly to participate in specific aspects." Anya stared at the screen. The thing she'd trusted, or almost trusted, the half-trust she'd extended despite knowing better, the desperation-fueled willingness to believe in the helpful version of a man who had spent 3 years teaching her that helpful wasn't real, had been a constructed approach. Manufactured. Someone had read her financial records and her emotional state and her love for her sister and built a trap out of the specific shape of her most desperate need. She pushed off the desk. "I need 20 minutes, she said. Min-jae looked at her. "Anya, 20 minutes, she said. "I'm not leaving. I'm not doing anything. I need 20 minutes to be alone with this before I can think about it functionally." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he stepped back. She went to the study. She sat in the leather chair behind his desk and looked at the city through the window and let herself feel it, the full weight of it, the betrayal and the manipulation and the specific humiliation of having been selected, assessed, and delivered like a commodity at the point of her maximum vulnerability. She let herself feel the fury and the grief and the exhaustion, all of it, because she'd learned in medicine that suppressed things didn't disappear. They just moved to places where they caused damage you didn't see coming. She sat with it for exactly 19 minutes. Then she went back to the operations room. "What does he have that you don't?" she said to Min-jae. He understood immediately. No preamble needed, no explanation of what she meant by the shift in pronoun. "Numbers," Min-jae said. "He's been building a coalition for 2 years, 3 smaller syndicates from Japan and 2 from China who want the Kang Network's distribution channels. They've agreed to support his move against me in exchange for access once he controls the operation." He paused. "He also has political coverage. 2 officials in the Seoul metropolitan government who've been on his payroll. If things get loud, he has mechanisms to manage the institutional response. So he can fight you openly and cover the aftermath. Yes. And the files he wants, if you gave them to him. Then he wouldn't need to fight. He'd have everything he needed to simply absorb. Make the transition appear voluntary. Document that I transferred operations to him legally." His jaw set. "It would look like a business merger from the outside." "And you'd be what? Retired?" "I'd be dead," Min-jae said, simply, factually. "Retired is not a category he operates in for people who know what I know." She looked at the map. 12 positions, 18 hours. "The files," she said. "Where are they?" Min-jae looked at her carefully. "Why?" "Because I want to understand what we're actually protecting. Not strategically. Specifically. What's in them?" He was quiet for a moment. "Names," he said. "People who've worked with my network. Transactions that document what they did. Political contacts. Financial relationships." He paused. "Evidence of things I've done that could destroy careers, prosecute people, end lives. The complete operational record of 7 years. It's also evidence against you." "Yes." "If those files became public, not Sato's, not used as leverage, but actually public..." She stopped. The thought was arriving as she spoke it, the way good diagnostic insight sometimes arrived. Not from planning, but from looking at the actual shape of the problem without the assumptions that usually constrain the view. What happens to Sato's coalition if the files are public? The operations room went slightly still. Min-jae looked at her. "Everyone in them goes down," she said, "including his partners, including his political coverage, including his mechanism for managing institutional response." She paused. "He built his leverage on the assumption that the files are a secret worth controlling. If they're not a secret, then they're not leverage," Min-jae said slowly. "They're just evidence." And you'd go down with them? Yes. He said it without hesitation. You've thought about this before, she said. Yes. And you didn't do it because the people in those files trusted me, he said. Some of them were coerced. Some of them were compromised under circumstances that aren't simple. Going public destroys them regardless of the nuance. He paused. I'm not willing to destroy people who trusted me in order to protect myself. Anya looked at him. She'd been in the study looking at the city 19 minutes ago, managing her fury at Ethan, and during those 19 minutes, something had also been moving in a quieter part of her mind. Not the fury, not the strategic thinking, but something older and more specific. The part of her that assessed people, that had been assessing this man for weeks, that had been cataloging not the surface, the power, and the controlled expression and the violence written in his body, but the other things, the 3 seconds of restraint, the precise agreements, the 3 a.m. window, and the way he'd looked standing alone in it like a man who'd stopped expecting company. The part of her that had noticed 2 days ago that she was starting to look for him when she came home. She pushed that away. Later. There's a version, she said, where selective disclosure does the work without burning everyone in the file. Min-jae's eyes sharpened. Sato's partners, she said, his coalition. If they understood that the Kong files going public would destroy them, not theoretically, but specifically, with enough targeted information released to make it credible, they might reconsider their support. That's a threat, he said. It's information architecture, she said. I'm a surgeon. You don't always cut everything. You cut what's necessary and leave what can survive. She paused. What do you need to make that communication to the right people before the 18 hours is up? Min-jae looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression moved through several registers she couldn't track precisely, and then it settled into something she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled mask, not the undefended thing she'd glimpsed occasionally, but something that had both of those in it and something else underneath. Something that looked like the specific disorientation of a man who had been operating alone for so long that being alongside someone felt genuinely foreign. 6 hours, he said. You have 12. Then we have room to do it correctly. They worked. That was what she remembered most clearly afterward, the specific texture of those hours, the operations room filling with purpose, Min-jae moving between his operators and the communication channels with the focused efficiency that was different from anything she'd seen in him before. Not the controlled public performance, not the stripped-down privacy of the mansion's quiet hours. This was him in his actual element, and it was, she didn't have a word for it that wasn't complicated. Impressive was too small, frightening was too simple. She worked beside him. She wasn't a strategist, she didn't pretend to be. But she understood systems, the way components interacted, the way pressure in one place transferred to another, the diagnostic logic of identifying what was actually failing versus what looked like it was failing. She caught 2 things in the communication drafts that would have read wrong to outside parties and said so directly, and Min-jae looked at her assessments and incorporated them without argument, and the operators worked around them both with a professional adaptability that suggested they'd simply decided she was part of the operation now and were getting on with it. By the 4th hour, 3 of Sato's coalition partners had received targeted communications. By the 6th hour, one of them had gone quiet in a way that Min-jae's operator interpreted as significant. By the 8th hour, the 2 sole government officials who represented Sato's political coverage had received evidence packages that documented their specific exposure in enough detail to communicate what going public would mean for them personally. By the 9th hour, one of the officials had made a phone call to a number in Tokyo that set off a reaction in Min-jae's monitoring infrastructure. He knows, Min-jae said, that you've been working against his coalition, that his position has been compromised. He looked at the screens. This changes his timeline. He'll move faster, Anya said. Yes. How much faster? The operator looked at the positioning data. The outer ring has collapsed from 12 to 9 positions in the last 40 minutes, she said. 3 positions near the facility have been vacated. Anya exhaled. He's consolidating, Min-jae said, concentrating force instead of maintaining the perimeter. His voice was level. He's decided to cut his losses on the coalition approach and move directly. Move directly toward what? Min-jae looked at her. She understood. toward you, she said. He needs the files, Minjay said. He doesn't have them. His coalition is fracturing. His political coverage is compromised. The only move left that recovers his position is acquiring those files by direct force before the situation deteriorates further. He paused. Which means he's coming here. Tonight. Within hours. Anya looked at the map. 9 remaining positions, reorganizing into a tighter configuration around the northern hills, around the mansion. She thought about Lily in the facility room, sitting up with her tablet and her bad tea, park outside the door. She thought about the compound arriving at noon. Whether noon was still going to be safe, whether the vacated positions near the facility meant the threat had moved away from Lily, or simply that the threat was concentrating somewhere else. Lily, she said. I'll have her moved to a secondary location within the hour, Minjay said. Somewhere Sato's people can't have had time to identify or position for. He paused. You have my word. She looked at him. Your word, she said. Yes. She held his gaze. All right, she said. The next 2 hours moved with the specific compressed urgency of a situation that was outpacing normal time. Decisions made quickly, positions adjusted, communications running through the operations room at a rate that produced a constant low-level ambient noise of people doing their specific work under pressure. Lily was moved. Anya spoke to her briefly on the phone, kept the information minimal, heard in Lily's voice the understanding that something serious was happening, and the deliberate choice not to ask questions that would make it harder. I love you, Lily said. I love you, Anya said. I'll see you tomorrow. She said it with the confidence she used on patients who needed to believe in a specific outcome. At 11 p.m., the mansion went into a lockdown configuration that Anya experienced as the sudden materialization of 8 additional security personnel who moved through the house with a focused professionalism that made the previous security arrangements look like a suggestion. The operations room went to full capacity. Minjay changed into something darker and lost his jacket entirely, and she noticed the shoulder holster that had been underneath it and the weapon it contained and filed that alongside everything else she'd been filing without comment. At 11:42 p.m., the perimeter alarm went active on the east side. At 11:43 p.m., the power to the mansion's external lighting grid went out. Anya stood in the operations room and watched the infrared display on the screens and counted the signatures moving through the dark outside the gates and understood, with the specific clarity that extreme situations sometimes produced, that the theoretical danger of the past weeks had just become immediate and physical and very real. Minjay appeared beside her. You need to go to the safe room, he said. No. Anya, I'm not going to sit in a room by myself while... I need you in the safe room, he said, not because I think you can't handle yourself. Because if something happens to me and you're not somewhere defensible, everything we've spent tonight building falls apart. The coalition pressure, the files, the communications, all of it requires both of us functional on the other side of this. She looked at him. His expression was the stripped-down one. No mask, no management, just the direct reality of a man looking at a person he needed to still exist when morning came. 8 minutes, he said. If the situation isn't resolved in 8 minutes, the secondary team arrives and this ends. I need you alive for 8 minutes. And you, she said, what do you need to be? His jaw tightened. Functional, he said. That's not good enough. Something crossed his face. Alive, he said. I intend to be alive. She grabbed his arm. It surprised both of them. The physical directness of it, her hand around his forearm, holding on with the grip she used when she needed a patient to stay present. You intend to be, she said. Not you'll try, not you'll do your best. You intend to be. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face, and the weight that had been standing outside the door moved fully into the room, and neither of them pretended it wasn't there. I intend to be, he said. She let go. She went to the safe room. She sat in the dark and listened to the sounds she could hear through the walls. Controlled, specific, not the chaos of a firefight, but the particular compressed violence of trained people operating in opposition to each other. Close quarters, purposeful. She counted time. She counted her own heartbeats, which was something she'd done since medical school when the situation was terrible and she needed an anchor. At 6 minutes and 40 seconds, the sound stopped. At 7 minutes even, Min-jae opened the safe room door. He had blood on the side of his face. Not his, the wrong angle for his own injury. His expression was the flat, scrubbed-down expression of someone who had just done something that required that specific quality of emptiness to perform. "It's clear," he said. She stood up. "Are you—" "Fine." He paused. "We have a problem." She looked at him. "Sato wasn't with them," he said. 9 of his people. All handled. Victor Sato was not among them. He paused. "Which means he knew we were prepared, which means—" "He still has a source," she said. Min-jae looked at her. "Yes." The word landed in the safe room like something with physical weight. 9 people. The perimeter breach. The coordinated timing. The power cut. All of it had the precision of an operation conducted with inside information about the mansion's security configuration. Information that the person they'd found and removed 8 months ago couldn't have provided because the configuration had been updated since. Someone current. Someone inside the house tonight. Anya looked at Min-jae and saw in his face the specific devastation of a man who had spent his entire adult life learning not to trust people and had been betrayed again anyway, who had built walls inside walls and secured room within room, and the thing he was trying to protect had gotten through regardless. "Who had access to tonight's security configuration?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. 6 people, he said. "All of them." He stopped. "All of them trusted," she said. "Yes." Like Jung was trusted. The silence was terrible. "Min-jae," she kept her voice level. "Who had access to the configuration and also knew about the safe room?" He looked at her, and she watched the answer arrive in his expression. Not with shock, because men like Min-jae had trained the shock out of themselves years ago, but with something worse, the specific quality of a wound that was already understood before it fully opened. 2 people, he said. "Myself." He paused. "And Han." Anya looked at him. "Han," she said. "He's been with me for 11 years, Min-jae said. His voice was absolutely level. "He ran security for my father before he ran it for me." A pause. "He's the one who briefed the secondary team tonight." She understood instantly. "The secondary team that was supposed to arrive in 8 minutes," she said. "Yes." "If Han is Sato's source, then the secondary team isn't coming," Min-jae said. "Or they're coming for a different purpose." The operations room was 30 feet away. Anya looked at the door of the safe room and then back at Min-jae and thought with a speed that the situation demanded. Han had access to the security configuration. Han knew about the safe room. Han had briefed the team that was supposed to be their backup. And Victor Sato had not been among the 9 people who'd breached the perimeter, which meant Victor Sato was somewhere else tonight, somewhere strategic, waiting for something. "Where's Lily?" she said. Min-jae's face changed. "Han coordinated the transfer," he said. The 2 sentences sat in the safe room. Anya didn't wait for a third. She moved past Min-jae into the corridor and pulled out her phone and called the number Park had given her 2 weeks ago for emergency contact and listened to it ring once, twice, 3 times. And then a voice she didn't recognize answered in Japanese, said 2 words she didn't understand, and disconnected. She lowered the phone. Min-jae was behind her. "They have her," Anya said. Not a question, not a collapse, not hysteria. She'd spent 15 years in emergency medicine, learning to stay functional when the worst thing was true, learning to convert the shattering impact of terrible information into the specific kinetic energy of action, and she did it now. Felt the terror and the fury and the love for her sister that lived somewhere permanently in her chest, all of it compressed into a single driving point of absolute clarity. She turned to face him. "Get me Sato's location," she said. Min-jae looked at her, the undefended expression, the weight. "Anya, you told me 8 weeks ago," she said, "that you'd do anything to protect the people you were responsible for." Her voice was not shaking. "I'm telling you the same thing. Get me his location, and then tell me you have a plan that ends with my sister walking out of whatever room he's put her in." Min-jae held her gaze. The mansion was dark and quiet around them, and somewhere in the city, Victor Sato was holding a 24-year-old woman who was still recovering from a treatment that hadn't finished. And 11 years of trust had just turned out to be 11 years of architecture built over a hollow floor. And everything that had seemed secured an hour ago had come apart with the specific efficiency of something that had been designed from the inside to come apart at exactly the location took 4 minutes to find. 4 minutes during which Anya stood in the corridor outside the safe room and held her phone and breathed with the deliberate mechanical regularity she used when she was operating on someone whose survival depended on her hands being steady. And Min-jae worked the operations room with 2 of his people in a focused silence that had stripped away everything except the immediate problem. 4 minutes that felt like a different unit of time entirely. Not longer, just denser, each second carrying more weight than normal seconds were built to hold. The operator's voice came through the operations room door. Incheon Harbor, abandoned shipping facility, Eastern Yard, Sato's secondary holding property. It's not registered to him directly. It runs through 4 shell companies, which is why we didn't have it flagged. A pause. Thermal imaging from the drone shows multiple heat signatures, at least 6 personnel. 2 signatures in a central structure that reads as a converted office block. 2 signatures. Lily. And someone with her. Min-jae came out of the operations room. He'd put his jacket back on. His expression was the operational one. Flat, specific, everything unnecessary removed. He looked at Anya and she looked back, and there was no time for the wait between them. No bandwidth for what had been moving through the space between them for weeks. Just 2 people and a problem, and the cold, clear arithmetic of what it was going to take. 6 of my people are still functional on the property, he said. The secondary team Han briefed. I've confirmed 3 of them have switched off their communication channels. The other 2 are on a route back here, and I believe they're clean, but I can't verify that with certainty in the time we have. So we're working with 6, plus us. She looked at him. You're not telling me to stay behind, she said. Would it work? No? Then I'm not wasting the time. He held her gaze. There are things you need to understand before we move. The facility is a working shipping yard, or it was. There are container corridors, internal structures, multiple approach angles. Sato will have the central block covered from multiple positions. Going in directly means we absorb fire before we reach the structure, so we don't go in directly. There's a maintenance access route on the southern perimeter. It runs along the harbor wall. It's exposed for approximately 30 meters before reaching the structure's service entrance, but the angle puts us outside the primary coverage lines. He paused. It's the best approach. It's still bad. How bad? 30 meters of open ground under active surveillance. In the dark. There are floodlights on the eastern and northern faces. The southern face runs darker. Darker isn't the same as dark. No, he said, it isn't. She absorbed this. The operational calculus of it. 30 meters, low light, 6 personnel plus the 2 of them, against Sato's 6 with potentially more she couldn't account for, with Lily somewhere in the central structure with a treatment compound that had arrived that morning and a body that was still in recovery. What does Sato want tonight, she said. Specifically, he has Lily, he has Han on the inside. His coalition is fractured, but he's still here. What does he actually want from this? Min-jae was quiet for a moment. Me, he said, and the files. Lily is the mechanism to get both. He'll call. Yes, probably within the hour. He'll offer a trade. And if you go to the trade point, he kills me, takes the files from whoever I've designated as a failsafe, and uses Lily as long as she's useful. His voice was absolutely level. He doesn't leave witnesses to things like tonight. Anya looked at him. Then we don't wait for the call, she said. No, he agreed. We don't. They moved in 15 minutes. The drive to Incheon was 40 minutes through the empty late-night highway. 2 vehicles, Min-jae in the first with 3 of his people, and Anya in the second with the remaining 3, the city falling away behind them, and the harbor air coming in through the cracked window, carrying salt and diesel, and the particular cold of water at night. She sat in the back seat and checked the medical kit she'd assembled from the mansion's supplies. She wasn't going into a firefight to provide cover fire. She was going because she was a trauma surgeon, and people were going to get hurt, and she was the most qualified person in both vehicles to deal with that when it happened. She was also going because Lily was in that building, and there was no version of this night in which she wasn't there when her sister came out. She thought about Han. 11 years. She'd seen him twice in the mansion, a man in his 50s, compact, with a stillness that she'd read as professional calm, and was now understanding differently. He'd been the one who briefed Park about Lily's original security detail. He'd been the one who coordinated the transfer to the secondary location that had turned out to be Sato's location. He'd been watching Min-jae for 11 years with the specific patience of someone who had decided on an outcome and was waiting for the right moment. She thought about what that cost. To be alongside someone for 11 years, to watch them navigate violence and loss, and a life built on the edge of catastrophic things. To be trusted with the innermost architecture of everything they'd constructed, and to be dismantling it the entire time. She thought about Min-jae finding out. She looked out the window at the highway moving underneath them and thought about a man who had told her, in a kitchen at 3 a.m., that the blood on his cuff wasn't his, and had sat shirtless in the kitchen light while she worked, and had not asked for sympathy or comfort or anything at all. Who had been alone in a very specific way for a very long time, and had decided, apparently, that this was simply the cost of the kind of life he'd chosen. She pushed it away. Incheon Harbor appeared ahead. The crane lights strung across the dark sky like industrial stars, the smell of the sea arriving fully now. The vehicles cut their lights a quarter-mile from the facility perimeter and moved slow. Min-jae's voice came through the earpiece that one of his people had fitted her with before they left. Low, precise, the specific register of command. South approach, single file. We hold at the maintenance gate until all 6 are in position, then we move on my signal. Anya stays at the rear of the second group until we breach the service entrance. Understood, said someone. I understand, she said quietly. A pause. Stay close, Min-jae said, just to her. The register shifted for those 2 words. Still controlled, still operational, but underneath it something that was not operational at all. You too, she said. The maintenance gate was a rusted panel in the harbor wall that one of Min-jae's people addressed with a tool she didn't look at closely, and then it was open and they were moving through into the dark service corridor that ran along the facility's southern face. The ground was wet concrete and broken gravel, and she moved carefully, watching her footing, the medical kit strapped across her back and her focus entirely on the figure in front of her and the sounds of the facility, the creak of metal cooling in the night, the movement of water against the harbor wall, the distant mechanical hum of a generator somewhere inside the complex. The 30-meter open ground was worse than the description. She understood that when they reached the end of the service corridor and she could see it, not complete darkness, but the shadow-cut gray of an industrial space at night, 2 floodlights on the far corners throwing light that didn't reach the southern face fully, but reached it enough. 30 meters of cracked concrete between the corridor mouth and the service entrance of the central structure. Low obstacles. Nowhere to go if someone was looking in this direction when they moved. Min-jae was at the front. He turned and looked at her. In the dark and the distance, she couldn't read his expression precisely. She held up one hand. She was fine. She was ready. She understood. And he turned back. Move, he said. They moved. The 30 meters were the longest of her life, not because she was slow. She ran. All of them ran, low and fast and silent, the way his people moved with the training that made it look almost easy. But there was a quality to that open ground that stripped everything down to the simplest possible truth. She was exposed, she was visible if anyone looked, and whether she reached the other side was a function of variables she could not control from inside the run. She reached the other side. All 8 of them reached the other side. She pressed against the service entrance wall and felt her heart in her throat and her breathing ragged from the run, and adrenaline, and something deeper, something primal, the ancient animal response to open ground and the possibility of being seen. Min-jae was beside her. She couldn't see blood on him. She ran her eyes over the people around her, all present, no injuries visible in the low light. Min-jae looked at her. She nodded. The service entrance was unlocked. That was the first thing that felt wrong. She registered it as Min-jae's hand went to the door and found it unlatched, and she saw in the set of his shoulders the same recognition. A facility that Sato was using as a holding site, with a man inside, would have the service entrance secured. An unlocked door was either a failure of operational discipline or an invitation. Min-jae pushed it open anyway, because Lily was inside. The interior of the structure was a converted warehouse, the kind that had been partially adapted into office space and then abandoned partway through. Raw concrete walls, sections of plasterboard framing that led nowhere, electrical conduit running along the ceiling, a central open area with the service detritus of a working facility that hadn't worked in years. The generator noise was louder in here. Emergency lighting ran at the floor level, giving everything a red-tinged amber cast that turned shadows into solid-looking shapes. They moved through the entrance corridor in a formation she stayed at the back of, watching Min-jae, watching the angles. They found the first of Sato's people in the second corridor. The man was sitting against the wall with his wrists zip-tied and a gag in his mouth, looking at them with eyes that contained the specific quality of a person who had been left as a message, alive, deliberately left visible. Min-jae looked at him for 1 second. "Where is she?" he said. The man's eyes moved upward and to the right, above them, to the right. Min-jae straightened. "It's a setup," one of his people said quietly. "Yes," Min-jae said. "Then we go anyway," Min-jae said. He moved forward. They found 2 more of Sato's people in the same condition in the next corridor, bound, gagged, alive, positioned to be found. 6 heat signatures on the drone, and 3 of Sato's 6 had been neutralized by something that wasn't them. Anya moved through the amber-lit corridor and her mind worked at the arithmetic of it. Sato had positioned himself with 6 people, 3 of whom had been removed before Min-jae's team arrived. Someone else was already here. She was working out who when they came through the internal door into the central space and found the converted office block's main room, and she stopped. The room was lit by battery lanterns arranged in a rough circle. Chairs in the center. Lily was in one of them, awake, frightened, a cable tie around her wrist but otherwise visibly uninjured, her eyes going wide and flooding with relief the moment she saw Anya that made Anya's chest seize with an emotion she didn't have time for. Victor Sato was in another chair, also zip-tied. He was in his 60s, compact, the kind of man whose physical diminution with age had not touched the quality of authority in his face. He had a cut above one eye, and his suit was torn at the shoulder, and he was looking at Min-jae with an expression that was furious and calculating in equal measure. Standing behind him was Han, not bound, but also not armed, or not visibly. He stood with his hands at his sides and his face carrying an expression that Anya couldn't read quickly, something complicated, layered in ways that the ambient light and the speed of the situation didn't give her enough information to decode. Min-jae stopped moving. The room was very quiet except for the generator. "Han," Min-jae said. "Min-jae." Han's voice was the same as she remembered it. Quiet, contained, the voice of a man who had learned to occupy minimal space. He looked at Min-jae with an expression that had grief in it, she realized. Not the performed kind, the real kind, the kind that was present despite everything, that didn't cancel out the betrayal but existed alongside it, in the same face at the same time. "You coordinated the transfer," Min-jae said. "You gave Sato the security configuration. You briefed the secondary team." He paused. "But you also—" He stopped, looked at Sato in the chair. "You were always working for him." "No," Han said. The word was quiet and absolute. Anya watched Min-jae's face, the processing. "Then explain what I'm looking at," Min-jae said. "I was working for your father," Han said, "before you took over, while you took over. I made agreements with Sato's father when your father was dying and the network needed to survive the transition, and there was no clear path forward." He paused. "I did it to protect the operation, to protect you. You call tonight protection. Tonight was containment." Han's eyes moved to Sato. "He was going to move against you regardless. He told me 2 weeks ago that the coalition fracturing had changed his timeline. He was going to hit the mansion, take you, and get the files by direct force. I fed him the security configuration to make him believe he had enough to succeed. I briefed the secondary team and then I sent them away." He paused. "I used the time his people spent breaching your perimeter to get here first." The room held the weight of this. Anya looked at Lily, who was looking at Han with the specific, focused attention of someone who had been sitting in that chair listening to conversations she wasn't supposed to hear for long enough to have formed conclusions. "He's telling the truth," Lily said. Her voice was steady in a way that surprised Anya. Her little sister in a zip tie in an industrial room at midnight, still watching and thinking and forming assessments. "The man who brought me here, Han, he kept everyone else away from me. He told me—" She stopped. "He told me his job was to make sure I was here when you arrived." Min-jae looked at Han. Han looked back. 11 years, Anya thought, the architecture of that. The weight of carrying an agreement made in a crisis and never finding the right moment to close it, never finding the path out that didn't require destroying the person you'd been protecting with it. "You should have told me," Min-jae said. "Yes," Han said. "I should have. 7 years. You watched me run this operation and manage Sato, and you should have—" "Yes." Han's voice didn't change a register. "I know." Min-jae looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Sato. Victor Sato looked back from the chair with the expression of a man who had spent 60 years building things and watching them fall apart and had decided somewhere along the way that his dignity was the last thing he controlled. "You're done," Min-jae said to him. Simple. Factual. The way he stated things that were simply true. "My people," Sato started. "Your coalition is fractured. Your political coverage is compromised. Your inside access to my network has been sitting in this room for the past 2 hours deciding whose side he was actually on." Min-jae paused. "You have no remaining options that end with you in an acceptable position. You know this." Sato's jaw tightened. "There are file," he said. "That will be released," Min-jae said, "in a structured way to the appropriate authorities over the next 60 days. Selectively. With specific attention to the parties who supported tonight's operation." He paused. "Including you." The room was quiet. Anya moved to Lily. She crossed the space in 6 steps and crouched in front of her sister's chair and looked at her. All of her, scanning with the clinical eye she couldn't switch off, looking for injury beneath the frightened relief on Lily's face. The zip tie had reddened her wrists, but hadn't broken skin. Her breathing was elevated but not labored. Her color was better than it had been a week ago, which told Anya that the treatment compound had been working even in the hours since this afternoon. "Hey," Anya said. "Hey." Lily's voice cracked slightly. Anya pulled a small tool from her kit and cut the zip tie. Lily grabbed her immediately, both arms around her neck, pulling her close with a grip that was weaker than it should have been, and still the most solid thing Anya had felt in weeks. She held her sister back. She pressed her face against Lily's shoulder and felt Lily's pulse against her cheek. Present, steady, alive, and held it together through an act of will that used up something fundamental she'd been running on reserves of since the invoice. "I have you," she said. "You're all right." "I know," Lily said. Her voice was muffled against Anya's shoulder. "I knew you were coming." "How?" A pause. "Because you're you," Lily said. Behind her, she could hear Min-jae speaking in low Korean to his people. The sounds of the room reorganizing, positions changing, the operational aftermath of a situation being managed. She heard Sato's voice, controlled but stripped of its authority, answering questions in a clipped, furious register. She heard Han, quieter, speaking to Min-jae in a way that had the specific rhythm of a very long overdue conversation being begun. She held Lily until her sister's grip loosened slightly. Then she pulled back and looked at her face. "Can you walk?" she said. "Yes." "Your treatment compound arrived this morning. The specialists have the protocol. You need to get back to the facility and— Anya." Lily looked at her, the quick, focused attention that had always seen through everything. "Are you okay?" She thought about the question. "Not yet," she said honestly. "But I will be." Lily nodded, once, like this was sufficient. Anya stood up. She turned back toward the room. Min-jae was looking at her. Not the operational look, not the managed public expression, just him, the way she'd started to understand him over weeks of proximity and 3 a.m. Kitchens and arguments and the slow, unavoidable accumulation of knowing a person, looking at her with that undefended thing fully present now. No attempt to fold it back, like the night had stripped the last of the careful management away and left only the actual truth of it. He crossed the room to her. He stopped in front of her and looked at Lily for a moment, a brief, direct look that she read as relief so compressed it barely showed, and then back at Anya. "She's all right," Anya said. "Yes." His voice was rough at the edge. "I see that." "Hunt, we'll deal with Han." He paused. "Not tonight." She looked at him, his face in the battery lantern light, the cut over his jaw she hadn't seen before, fresh from the mansion breach, the way he was holding himself, the exhaustion underneath the operational stillness, the kind of exhaustion that went down past physical, that was in the structure of him. She reached up and touched the cut. He went very still. Her fingers against the edge of his jaw, assessing. Not deep, didn't need closure, would bruise but leave nothing permanent, clinical. That was what she told herself. His hand came up and covered hers, not removing it, just holding it there. "Anya," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. "Not yet. Not here." He looked at her. The weight. "When?" he said. "When Lily is back in the facility, when the files are with the right people, when Han has said whatever he has left to say to you, when Victor Sato is someone else's problem." She held his gaze. "When the sun comes up, and it's tomorrow, and we can—" She stopped. "When we can do it in a context that doesn't have blood in it." He looked at her for a long moment. His thumb moved once against the back of her hand. "Tomorrow," he said. "Yes." He let go. He turned back to the room with the operational expression reassembling itself the way it always did. The mask not quite the same as before, something slightly different in its construction now, something that showed at the edges. They were moving toward the exit when the door at the far end of the room opened. Not their entrance. The other door. The one that led deeper into the facility, the one none of Min-jae's people had come through. Ethan Graves walked in. Anya stopped. He was in a dark jacket, no tie, his hair slightly wrong. He looked at the room, at Sato in the chair, at Han, at Min-jae's people, at Min-jae, and his eyes moved through it all with the rapid calculation of a man who had walked into a situation that had not resolved the way he expected and was reassessing in real time. Then his eyes landed on Anya. Something moved through his expression, not guilt, not apology. Something worse. The look of a man who had made a specific calculation about another person, had built an operation around what he'd assessed as her vulnerability, and was encountering the evidence that the assessment had been wrong. "Anya," he said. His voice was performing calm. She looked at him. The fury was still there. It had been there since Min-jae showed her the communication records in the operations room, cold and dense, and it had stayed through the drive and the 30 meters of open ground and the central room and Lily's arms around her neck. It had been waiting with the patience of something that understood it would get its moment. "You sold me," she said, "to pay a debt." He opened his mouth. "Don't," she said. "Don't perform the explanation. I've already seen the files." His expression shifted. "The arrangement was, 14 months ago you started working for Sato. You identified me through my hospital's financial records. You calculated the specific moment when my sister's treatment costs would put me in a position where I'd accept help from someone I should have run from." She held his gaze. "You showed up at my door with your hands open, and you took my desperation, and you handed it to a man who wanted to use it against someone else." The room was very quiet. Ethan looked at her. "You're not dead," he said, like this was the relevant metric. "No," she agreed. "I'm not." "The situation is over," Min-jae said. He'd moved without her tracking it, was now positioned between Ethan and the exit, not aggressively, just present. The quality of his stillness in this moment was different from all the previous versions of his stillness. This was the one underneath everything, the one that existed before management, before performance, before the careful calibration of power. Ethan looked at him. Whatever he saw there, he stopped talking. "You had a choice," Min-jae said, At every point in the last 14 months. You chose this. He paused. Now the choice belongs to other people. Two of his people moved. Ethan didn't resist. Anya watched them take him out of the room and turned back to where Lily was standing and found her sister watching her with the careful, sharp attention that she'd had since childhood. That was your ex, Lily said. Yes. The one who... Yes. Lily was quiet for a moment. Are you okay? She said again. Anya looked at the door Ethan had been taken through. She thought about the invoice, about the restaurant where he'd sat across from her with his hands open, about the 14 months prior to that, and the 3 years before that, and the ring she'd given back on a Wednesday. Getting there, she said. They moved toward the exit. Min-jae fell into step beside her, close enough that she was aware of him in the specific, constant, unavoidable way she'd been aware of him for weeks, and had been refusing to fully acknowledge. And she let herself be aware of it now, without pushing it to the edge of her attention. Lily walked on her other side. Outside the service entrance, the night air hit them, salt and cold, and the distant sound of water against the harbor wall. The sky above the facility had gone slightly lighter at the horizon, the first almost imperceptible suggestion of the shift between deep night and the hour before dawn. Not tomorrow yet, but close. They were 20 meters from the vehicles when Min-jae's phone rang. He answered it. She heard 3 seconds of someone's voice and watched his face, which had gone completely still in a way that was different from all the previous varieties of his stillness. Not operational, not controlled, but the specific absolute stop of a man hearing something that reorganized the structure of the next several hours. He lowered the phone. What? She said. He looked at her. Sato's 3 remaining partners, he said. The ones who didn't respond to the communications tonight. They've moved. He paused. They've made contact with the Seoul Metropolitan Authority. They're offering testimony on Sato's operations in exchange for immunity. He paused again. They want the Kang files as corroborating documentation. She stared at him. Which means by morning, he said, this becomes a very different kind of problem. Not Sato's problem, not mine. An institutional problem. He looked at the brightening horizon. If I release the files to the authority with Sato's partner's testimony as the framework, I control the structure of what gets investigated and in what sequence. But it requires me to move in the next, he checked his phone, 4 hours, before the partners change their position or the coverage window closes. And if you don't move in 4 hours, then the files get subpoenaed without my input, the investigation runs without my framing. Everyone in those files goes down in an order and a manner that I have no ability to influence. He paused. Including people I'm responsible for who deserve better than that. Anya looked at him. The horizon getting lighter. Lily beside her, alive and present and recovering. Her wrist where the zip tie had been reddened and her eyes taking in the exchange with the quiet intelligence she'd always had. 4 hours. Min-jae looked at her with the weight fully present, no management, the actual thing. And she understood that she was part of the decision he was making, that her presence in this moment was not incidental, that he was telling her this instead of simply moving because something between them had shifted past the point where he made decisions in isolation and assumed she was simply managed alongside them. What do you need? She said. He looked at her. You, he said, simply. Not romantically, not with the weight of all the weeks behind it, though that was present too. Practically. Specifically. You, your clarity, your presence, the way you think about systems, the way you hold things together under pressure while I handle the parts of this that require a different kind of handling. She looked at Lily. Lily looked back at her. Go, Lily said. You need to get back to the facility. Park will take me. Lily's eyes moved to Min-jae. You'll make sure of that. Yes, Min-jae said. Lily looked back at Anya. Go, she said again. I've been fine for the last 3 hours in a zip tie in a warehouse. I think I can manage a car ride. Anya held her sister's gaze for a moment. Then she pulled her close once more. Brief, hard, her face against Lily's hair. And then she let go. She turned to Min-jae. 4 hours, she said. Tell me the structure. He nodded once. They moved toward the vehicles, and behind them the horizon continued its slow lightening, and the harbor breathed in and out with the indifferent rhythm of water that had been moving long before any of tonight's events, and would continue moving long after. And somewhere in the city, the machinery of institutions was beginning to turn in a new direction. And Victor Sato was sitting in a chair in a converted warehouse, understanding that the architecture of the last 14 months had collapsed under him, and Han was in the back seat of a vehicle having a conversation 11 years overdue. And Ethan Graves was in the custody of people who would make specific decisions about him that Anya had already decided she was not going to involve herself in, because she had looked at him in that room and felt the fury and then felt it drain away into something flatter and more final. The specific emotional resolution of a person who has stopped carrying something heavy and found that the absence of it is its own kind of answer. The vehicle moved through the pre-dawn streets. Min-jae sat beside her and talked through the structure of the next 4 hours in the quiet operational register. And she listened and asked questions and caught 3 things he'd missed and said so. And he incorporated them without argument. And outside the windows, Seoul came slowly back to life, the way cities did at the edge of morning. Not all at once, incrementally, the first lights and the first movement and the first sound of the city resuming itself after the private hours of the night. She was aware of his shoulder against hers. She didn't move away. They were 20 minutes from the city center when his phone rang again. He answered. She heard the voice on the other end. His attorney, she recognized the register, and watched Min-jae's face as he listened, and she saw the expression change once, quickly, and then go back to still. He ended the call. "What?" she said. "Han," he said. "In the vehicle on the way back. He's been talking to my people." He paused. "There are things I didn't know. About my father. About the agreement Han made during the transition." A pause. "About what my father asked him to do if anything happened." She looked at him. "The agreement wasn't entirely what Sato presented it as," Min-jae said. "Han was managing Sato, feeding him enough to keep him contained, enough to prevent him from moving against the network while I consolidated. He's been doing it for 7 years. A pause. "He should have told me. He made a decision that wasn't his to make." He paused again. "But he wasn't selling me to Sato. He was trying to protect the transition my father couldn't complete." The vehicle moved through the brightening streets. Anya looked at the city. "What are you going to do?" she said. Min-jae was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet," he said. And the honesty in it, the admission of not knowing, from a man who had been making decisions alone under pressure for 7 years, had a specific weight she felt in her chest. She reached over and put her hand on his, not clinically, not managed, just her hand on his hand in the back of a vehicle at 4 a.m. while the city came back to life around them and the night moved toward its ending. He turned his hand over and held hers. They didn't speak. Outside, Seoul gathered itself into morning. Its lights and its noise and its enormous, indifferent beauty, the city that had swallowed desperate people for 100 years and asked nothing about their suffering and continued regardless. And inside it, 2 people sat in the back of a moving vehicle, holding on to each other in the specific way that people hold on when they've come through something terrible. And the end isn't quite here yet, but the shape of it is visible. Close. Almost. The 4 hours were the most consequential of Min-jae's life, and he spent them at a conference table in his attorney's office building in Yoido, with Anya beside him, and the city coming up into full morning light outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, while his attorney and 2 people from the Seoul Metropolitan Prosecutor's Office sat across from them, and the files moved from encrypted storage into official hands, one structured document at a time. It was not dramatic. That was the thing about the endings of violent things. The actual ending, the administrative reality of it, was never the explosion. It was paper. It was language negotiated between people in a room while coffee went cold in paper cups, and the city outside moved through its morning without knowing anything had changed. The violence happened at night in shipping yards, and it ended in conference rooms at 6 a.m., with attorneys discussing the sequencing of document release and the parameters of cooperation agreements. And the distance between those 2 things was the full width of the life Min-jae had been living for 7 years. Anya understood this. She sat beside him and drank her cold coffee and read the documents before they were released and caught 2 things that his attorney had missed: framing issues. places where the language created exposure for people tangentially involved who hadn't earned what that exposure would cost them, and said so with a precision that made the prosecutor's people look at her with a recalibration she noted and ignored. Min-jae watched her do this. Not obviously. He had the meeting to manage, the attorney to direct, the specific careful sequencing of which names went forward first and which were held for the second release and which were structured as supporting evidence rather than primary subjects. He had 11 years of operational architecture to dismantle in a way that protected the people it was possible to protect and delivered the people who had earned delivery. He was present for all of it. He did it well. And he watched her. The way she held her pen, the way her eyes moved through a document, not linearly, but in the jumping associative pattern of a mind that read for structure rather than sequence, identifying the load-bearing points first. The way she said this clause creates liability for the supply coordinator at the third-tier level, and he was coerced. You need to restructure the attribution without looking up from the page, just stating it flatly, the way she stated things that were simply true. He had a meeting full of important decisions to make, and he was watching his wife read documents. He understood something about himself in that moment that he filed away to look at later when the room was empty. The Sato file went first. Victor Sato's operational history, the coalition communications, the financial records documenting the targeting of Anya through Ethan Graves, all of it went forward as a primary package, clean and complete, structured to answer the questions the prosecutors would ask before they asked them. The prosecutor's representative, a woman in her 40s, who had the specific quality of someone who had spent 20 years not being surprised by the things powerful people did, read through it with professional stillness and then looked at Min-jae. "This is comprehensive," she said. "Yes," he said. "This also implicates your own operations significantly." "Yes." A pause. "You understand what you're handing us?" "I understand exactly what I'm handing you," he said. "That's why I structured the release the way I did. I'm not handing you a weapon. I'm handing you a case. There's a difference." The prosecutor looked at him. Then she looked at Anya. Anya looked back. "The cooperation parameters," the prosecutor said, returning to Min-jae. His attorney took over the language at that point, and Min-jae sat back and let him. And under the table his hand found Anya's and held it with the same quality of grip she'd used on him in the vehicle. Not romantic, not managed, just two people holding on while the room moved around them. She didn't pull away. By 8 a.m., the files were in the prosecutor's hands. By 9 a.m., Min-jae's attorney had confirmed the cooperation framework, his testimony, his documentation, his full accounting of 7 years of Kang Syndicate operations in exchange for a structured process that distinguished between principals and coerced participants, that gave the prosecutor a workable case against Sato's network and the two government officials and the coalition partners without simply burning everyone in the files indiscriminately. It was not immunity. He hadn't asked for immunity. His attorney had, twice, and Min-jae had told him to stop twice, with a flatness that communicated this was not a negotiating position. "You're going to be investigated," his attorney said after the prosecutors had left. "Yes," Min-jae said. "Potentially charged." "Possibly." "The cooperation framework limits exposure significantly, but it doesn't—" "I know what it doesn't do," Min-jae said. "I know what I'm giving up." "I've known since last night." He paused. "Do your job." His attorney looked at him for a moment, then at Anya, then back at Min-jae with the expression of a man who had been doing this work for 15 years and had just encountered something that didn't fit his existing categories. "All right," he said. They left the building at 9:17 a.m. The street outside was Seoul in full morning, traffic and people and food vendors, and the specific bright noise of a city that had been going since 5 a.m. and would continue until 2 the following morning without interruption. The sun was up and the air was cold and clean, the way autumn air in this city was sometimes clean, stripped of its usual layering by the overnight wind off the water. Anya stood on the pavement and breathed it. Min-jae stood beside her. They were both exhausted in a way that had moved past the physical into something structural. The exhaustion of a system that had been running at crisis capacity for hours and had now reached the point where the crisis was resolved and everything was demanding payment at once. She could feel it in her hands. In the way sounds seemed slightly louder than they should, the way the light off the building across the street had a mild quality of too much. "Lily," she said. Park confirmed she arrived at the facility at 4 a.m. The treatment team was there. Her markers at the morning check were good. He paused. Better than good. Anya closed her eyes for 1 second. The relief was enormous and quiet, a wave that moved through her from somewhere central and left everything slightly different in its wake. Less compressed, less braced, like a hand that had been clenched for 6 months, finally letting go enough to feel the ache of all that holding. She opened her eyes. "Han," she said. Minjae was quiet for a moment. They were still standing on the pavement outside the building, and neither of them had moved toward the vehicle yet, and the city moved around them with its morning indifference. "He's at the mansion," Minjae said. "I spoke to him for 2 hours last night while you were with Lily on the phone." A pause. "And then I spoke to my attorney this morning about a separate matter." She looked at him. "He'll be named as a cooperating witness," Minjae said. His agreement with Sato's father, the specifics of it, the coercive elements, the reasons it was made during the transition period, that goes into the record as context. It doesn't erase the breach, but it changes the shape of it. What happens to him? He leaves the network, permanently. That was never going to be otherwise, and I can understand what he did and still know that what he did ended the possibility of what we had. He paused. "But I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "He served my father for 20 years. He held things together during the worst period of the transition when I was 27 years old and didn't know what the hell I was doing. He made a bad agreement under impossible circumstances and then spent 7 years trying to manage it without making it worse." A pause. "I'm not going to destroy him." Anya looked at his face. The exhaustion in it. The specific quality of a man who had been betrayed and had looked at the betrayal and decided how much of himself he was going to let it take. "That's—" She stopped. "What?" "Generous," she said. "Considering." His jaw tightened slightly. "It's accurate," he said. "Generous has nothing to do with it." She almost smiled. Almost. They drove to the facility. She sat with Lily for 2 hours while the morning moved through its middle section, and the treatment team came and went with their checks and their careful optimism that was no longer quite as carefully managed as it had been, the numbers moving in the direction that numbers needed to move. Lily was sitting up with her tablet again. The bad tea. The deliberate studied casualness over the sharp eyes. "You look like you haven't slept," Lily said. "I haven't." "How bad was it?" Anya looked at her sister. The reddened marks on her wrists from the zip tie already fading. The color in her face that had been absent for 6 months and was now gradually returning. "Bad enough," she said. "Over now." "The man, Minjae." Lily set the tablet down. "Tell me about him." "Lily, you've been married to him for almost 2 months. I've been in this facility for most of it. I want to know about him." Anya looked at the window. Seoul outside, the Han River visible at the distance, catching the morning light. "He's—" she started, stopped. "He's not what I thought he was when I met him." "What did you think he was?" "Dangerous, controlled, someone who used people as instruments." "And now—" She thought about the conference table at 6 a.m. The documents moving into official hands. The specific look on his face when the prosecutor had understood the scope of what he was giving up and had looked at him, and he'd said, "I know what I'm giving up," with the flatness of a man who had made a decision and was not interested in being acknowledged for it. "He's still dangerous," she said. "He'll probably always be dangerous. That's not a quality that gets surgically removed." She paused. "But he's—" She stopped again. "He carries things that aren't his responsibility to carry. He protects people who have no claim on his protection. He refuses shortcuts that would make his life significantly easier because the shortcut costs someone else something he considers too much." A pause. "He does all of this without telling anyone about it." Lily was quiet for a moment. "You love him," she said. Anya looked at her hands. "I haven't said that," she said. "No," Lily agreed. You described him for 30 seconds and used the word he 14 times like you were counting inventory. Same thing. Anya looked at her sister. Lily looked back with the specific gentle implacability that she'd had since she was 7 years old, the youngest sibling quality of having watched someone longer than anyone else, and therefore knowing them in ways they'd stopped knowing themselves. The contract, Anya said. We had I know about the contract, Lily said. You told me weeks ago. Is the contract what you think about when you look at him? She didn't answer. Lily reached over and took her hand. Weaker than it should have been, still. Warm. You spent 6 months destroying yourself to save me, Lily said quietly. You sold your apartment and worked shifts that should have killed you and walked into a casino basement at 2 in the morning with nothing but a hospital invoice and made a deal with a man who frightened you because you needed him to. She paused. I don't want you to spend the next 6 months talking yourself out of something that's already true. Anya looked at their hands. He has a complicated situation, she said. You're a trauma surgeon. You've never encountered a situation you didn't try to fix. This isn't a situation I can fix. Nobody's asking you to fix it, Lily said. I'm asking you to stop running the triage assessment and just… She paused. Just let the thing be what it is. The facility room was quiet and warm, and outside the window the city continued its afternoon without them, indifferent and beautiful. Get some sleep, Lily said. You look terrible. You keep saying that. You keep looking it. Anya squeezed her hand once and let go and stood up. She kissed her sister's forehead the way she'd done since Lily was small, and Lily made the same sound she'd made since she was small, half protest, half comfort, and Anya picked up her jacket and walked to the door. Anya, Lily said. She stopped. Thank you, Lily said, for all of it. All the parts I know about and all the parts you didn't tell me. Anya stood in the doorway. Always, she said. She went home. The mansion was different in daylight when nothing was wrong. She'd lived in it for 2 months, but almost always under the weight of the situation. The threat, the management of it, the constant low-level pressure of a life that required her to be ready for something difficult at any given moment. Now she walked through the front entrance in the afternoon quiet and felt the difference like a pressure change. The marble floors, the high ceilings, Mrs. Cho appearing from the kitchen with a look that communicated she was aware of the general shape of the previous 18 hours and had opinions about it that she had decided not to articulate. There's food, Mrs. Cho said. Thank you. You should eat and sleep in that order. I know. Mr. Kong is in the study. Anya looked at the hallway. Thank you, she said again. She ate first. Alone in the kitchen, standing at the counter, because sitting down felt like it would cost her the energy she was currently running on the last reserves of. The food was warm and real, and she ate it without tasting it. And when she finished, she put the dish in the sink and stood for a moment looking at the kitchen. The 3 a.m. kitchen. The first aid kit. His shoulder under her hands, the scars, the way he'd sat in absolute silence while she worked and asked questions in that slightly rougher register, the private one, the one that existed underneath the managed version. You always stare at injuries this intensely? I'm trying to understand how you're still alive. She walked down the hallway to the study. She knocked. Come in, he said. He was at the desk. Not working. Or he'd stopped working when he heard her footsteps. The desk had documents on it that were not the crisis documents of the previous days, but the regular correspondence of a man whose legitimate business operations had continued moving regardless of everything else, the kind of thing that accumulated when you were otherwise occupied. He looked up when she came in, and his eyes moved over her face with the rapid assessment she recognized from the first night in the casino, checking she was whole, she was present, she was standing. He looked tired, not the operational exhaustion from before, but that had been stripped, functional, kept in its place. This was the real thing, the kind that showed when the situation had passed and the body finally presented its bill. His jacket was off, his sleeves rolled. The cut on his jaw had darkened to a bruise. He sat behind the desk like a man who had forgotten to leave it, because leaving it would require deciding what came next. Anya crossed the room and sat in the chair across from him. They looked at each other. You said tomorrow, he said. His voice was quiet. When we could do it without blood in it. Yes. It's tomorrow. She looked at him. 2 months ago, she had stood in a casino basement soaking wet with a hospital invoice and a terminal shortage of options, and she had looked at this man across a poker table and hated that she needed him. She had stood in front of an attorney and signed a contract and told herself it was a transaction and a year was manageable, and she was a rational adult who had been through worse and could keep this in its proper category. She thought about the categories. How long she'd maintained them. How precisely she'd managed the boundaries, the rules, the careful architecture of in public this, in private that, no obligations beyond the contract. She thought about the 30 meters of open ground at Incheon Harbor and the specific quality of her heartbeat during those seconds. Not fear of dying, or not only that, but the specific fear of not reaching the other side, which was different, which was about what was on the other side. I think I started to fall in love with you, she said, the night I stitched your shoulder. Min-jae looked at her. That was the 3rd week, he said. I know. You spent the next 6 weeks being furious at myself about it, she said. Yes. Something moved through his expression. The undefended thing fully out now, no attempt to fold it back. I told myself, he said carefully, that I was maintaining appropriate boundaries given the circumstances, that what I felt was... He stopped. Proximity. Shared stress. Things that look like something else when you're living in close quarters under pressure. Did you believe that? For about 2 weeks, he said. And then you told me in the car that the regulatory hold on Lily's compound was through a Tokyo subsidiary, and your voice was completely level, and your hands were completely still, and I... He stopped again. What? I thought, if anything happens to her, I will burn down every structure I've ever built. He said it simply, matter of fact. And I understood that wasn't a professional assessment. She looked at him. The contract expires in 3 weeks, she said. Yes. The legal arrangement we entered would end. I would take the million and... She stopped. That was the plan. Yes. Are you going to tell me that's what you want? He held her gaze. No, he said. What do you want? He was quiet for a moment. She'd learned to read his silences, the different qualities of them, the compressed ones and the processing ones and the rare genuine ones where he was simply finding the honest word instead of the managed word. You, he said. Not the arrangement, not the contract. You. He paused. The person who walked into a casino at 2 a.m. with an invoice and refused to be frightened into compliance. The person who stitched my shoulder at 3 a.m. and told me she was trying to understand how I was still alive. The person who sat in a prosecutor's conference room this morning and caught 2 framing errors in documents that my attorney wrote and didn't once perform the discovery for the room. He paused. The person who is currently sitting in my study running a triage assessment on whether to trust me and trying not to let me see her do it. She looked at him. I'm not hiding it, she said. No, he agreed. You're not. His mouth curved slightly. You're terrible at hiding things. I'm a trauma surgeon. I state what I observe. Then state what you observe. She looked at him steadily. A man who spent his entire adult life carrying things alone and has become so good at it that he's forgotten there's another way, she said. Who is loyal to people who don't always deserve it and protects people who don't always know they're being protected. Who sat at a conference table this morning and handed over 7 years of his life and didn't once ask to be acknowledged for it. She paused. Who frightened me when I met him and hasn't stopped frightening me since, but differently now. The second kind of frightening, the kind that means something matters. Min-jae looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up. He came around the desk and stopped in front of her chair, and she stood up too because sitting while he stood felt like the wrong arrangement for what was happening. And they were close enough now that she could see the tiredness in his face and the bruise on his jaw and the specific undefendedness that he'd stopped trying to manage back into control. He touched her face, the way he'd done it once before, carefully, like something he'd been thinking about for a long time and was finally allowing himself. his thumb against her cheek, his eyes on hers. "I tried," he said, "not to fall in love with you." "I know," she said. "You did a bad job." "Yes." "I did too." His forehead came down against hers. They stood like that for a moment, just that, foreheads together, the exhaustion and the weeks of it and the weight of everything that had happened between the casino and this study settling around them like weather that was finally clearing. Then she kissed him. Not the way she'd imagined it in the weak moment she'd allowed herself before, not the performed version that her mind had constructed and immediately suppressed. Real, direct, the specific reality of two tired people who had been circling each other for months finally stopping. He kissed her back with a thoroughness that told her the patience had cost him considerably more than he'd let show. And his hands were on her face, and her hands were against his chest, and the study was quiet around them and outside. Seoul continued its evening without comment. When they stopped, she kept her eyes closed for a moment. "We're still complicated," she said. "Yes," he said. "The investigation, the cooperation framework. Your attorney called twice while we were in the prosecutor's office." "I know." "Your life is not a simple structure that I'm walking into." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." His hands were still on her face. "Are you telling me that as information or as a problem?" She opened her eyes. "Information," she said. "I already know about the structure. I've been living in it for 2 months." She paused. "I'm a trauma surgeon. I don't walk away from complex cases because they're complex." Something moved through his expression that she didn't have a name for yet. Something that was going to take time to learn, she thought. The specific language of this face, the register beneath the registers, the thing that showed when something mattered enough to get through all the layers. "The contract," he said. "What about it?" "It expires in 3 weeks. The arrangement ends—" "Stop," she said. "I know what the contract says. I signed it." She held his gaze. "I'm telling you, the contract is not the relevant document anymore." He looked at her. "Then what is?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "Something we write ourselves. Without attorneys." She paused. "Without timelines." Min-jae held her gaze for a long moment. Then he did something she'd seen only once before. The night in the shipping yard when she'd pressed her hands against the wound and he'd touched her face in the dark and told her she was worth it. He let everything down. Not just the mask, not just the managed surface, but the full weight of everything that lived underneath it. The loneliness and the violence and the 7 years of carrying things alone, and the specific profound disorientation of a man who had stopped expecting to be alongside anyone and was finding that the absence of that expectation was no longer accurate. He looked like himself, just himself, without the architecture. "All right," he said quietly. She nodded. She stepped back, enough to breathe, enough to let the moment settle into the room without collapsing it with more than it could hold right now. She looked at the desk. The documents, the bruise on his jaw. "You need to sleep," she said. "So do you." "I know." She picked up her jacket from the chair. "But you look worse." His mouth curved. "That's not medically possible," he said. "You've been awake." 38 hours, she said. "I know, I've done worse." She paused at the study door. "There's food in the kitchen. Mrs. Cho left it." "I know her methods." "Eat first," she said, "then sleep." She walked out of the study and down the hallway to her rooms and lay down on the bed without taking off her shoes and was unconscious in approximately 4 minutes. She dreamed of nothing. When she woke, it was dark outside and the city was in its evening configuration, and she could hear, somewhere in the house, the sound of jazz playing low. She lay on her back for a moment and looked at the ceiling and let herself be awake slowly, the luxury of it, the rare and specific luxury of waking without an alarm and without an immediate crisis to move toward. The investigation would begin formally within the week. Min-jae's attorney had been clear about the timeline. The prosecutor's office moving quickly, because the Sato case created institutional pressure, the Kang files providing enough documentation to move multiple cases simultaneously. There would be months of it. Testimony, documentation review. The careful, structured accounting of 7 years that would determine which parts of what Min-jae had built could survive scrutiny and which could not. Kang Capital, the legitimate holdings company, the real estate and the investment infrastructure, was clean. His attorney had said this 3 times with the emphasis of someone who needed it to be heard. The surface layer was genuine. The operations beneath it were where the complexity lived, and the complexity was going to require time and documentation and the cooperation framework to navigate. He would lose some things. That was already clear. He might face charges despite the cooperation. There were limits to what the framework protected, and some of what was in those files put him personally at the center of decisions that would not be comfortable to account for publicly. His attorney was skilled and the framework was structured carefully, but skilled attorneys and careful frameworks were not guarantors. She had thought about all of this during the drive back from the facility, had sat with it the way she sat with difficult diagnoses, not trying to resolve it, just holding it up to the light and looking at it honestly. She was still here. That was the information that mattered. She got up and washed her face and went down the hall toward the Jazz. He was on the balcony. Not the 3 a.m. version, not the alone in the dark version, not the figure she'd found that first night standing with his back to her, looking at the city like a man who'd stopped expecting anyone to look for him. He was standing at the railing with a glass of something he wasn't drinking and his jacket off and his face toward the city. And when he heard her step on the threshold, he turned, just turned, looked at her, the full version of his face. "You slept," she said. 3 hours. More than nothing. Yes. His eyes moved over her. "You look better. You look less like you're going to fall over." The corner of his mouth moved. She came out onto the balcony and stood beside him at the railing. Seoul below them, its lights and its noise and its enormous ongoing life. The river catching the city's reflection, the mountains in the distance that were visible on clear nights past the high-rise silhouettes. She'd looked at this view many times since the first night, and it had always felt like someone else's city, someone else's view, something she was occupying temporarily and would leave. It didn't feel that way tonight. She felt him looking at her. "The file release goes public tomorrow," he said. "My attorney confirmed before I slept. The prosecutor's office is moving quickly." "I know. It's going to be visible." He paused. "My name will be in it, the Kang network, everything that's been operating under the surface layer." He looked at the city. "Some of the people who've worked with me legitimately are going to have difficult conversations. The business relationships, the investment infrastructure." A pause. "Your name will be in it, as my wife, as a connected party." She turned to look at him. "Are you telling me to leave?" she said. "No." Immediate, flat. "I'm telling you what's coming so that you have complete information. The thing you said I should have given you at the beginning." He held her gaze. "You get to decide with full information. That's—" He stopped. "That matters to me." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm a trauma surgeon," she said. "The hospital will see the news and there will be a conversation and I will have it honestly and my work will either stand on its record or it won't." She paused. "My work stands on its record." "Anya." "I'm not leaving," she said. "Stop building the exit for me." His jaw tightened. She reached out and took the glass from his hand and set it on the railing and turned to face him directly. "You have spent your entire life," she said, "building structures to protect people from the worst versions of the things you're involved in. You've done it alone because you decided at some point that being alongside someone was a liability you couldn't afford." She paused. "I'm telling you that decision is no longer accurate." He looked at her. "You are one of the most difficult women I have ever encountered," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "You don't do anything I tell you. Medically significant things only. You showed up in an armored vehicle at an active security situation because your sister was in a building. She was in a zip tie. Of course I did. You sat in a prosecutor's conference room at 6 in the morning and started editing the documents. Someone had to." He looked at her. The weight between them, still there, but different from all the previous versions. Not the suppressed version or the managed version or the almost said something version, just the thing itself, present and real, and no longer requiring either of them to pretend it wasn't there. "I love you," he said. Simple. No performance. No careful calibration. She'd been waiting for him to say it the way she sometimes waited for a patient's vitals to stabilize, with the focused, controlled patience of someone who knew it was coming and was holding the space for it. "I know," she said. "Is that—" "I love you too," she said. "I told you about the stitching." His mouth curved, a real one. Not the fractional movement she'd been cataloging for months, but the actual thing. The smile that had been buried under 7 years of carefully maintained expression, warm and slightly disbelieving, and entirely his. She put her hand against his chest, over the scar she'd felt that first night under her fingers. His heartbeat. Present. Steady. "We'll build something different," she said, "with what's left. Whatever the investigation keeps, and whatever it takes, we build from there." She paused. "Together." He looked at her. Then he pulled her in and she let him, her face against his shoulder, his arm around her, the jazz coming low through the balcony door behind them, and the city below doing what the city always did. Moving, breathing, continuing, making no promises and keeping none. Enormous and indifferent, and full of lives that had all their own weights to carry through the particular darkness that preceded each of their own dawns. They stood like that for a long time, not talking, not managing, not performing anything for anyone. Just two people on a balcony at the end of a very long night, holding on to each other while the city moved underneath them. While somewhere in a facility across the city, Lily slept with better numbers on her charts than yesterday and the day before. While the investigation machinery was already in motion doing the grinding institutional work of accounting for the past. While Han sat in a room somewhere, writing down 11 years of a story that had needed telling for years and was finally being told. While Victor Sato sat in a prosecutor's holding room, understanding that the architecture he'd built was gone, and the patience he'd invested in taking it apart had produced instead its own demolition. While all of it happened, they stood there. At some point, Min-jae's chin came down to rest on the top of her head. At some point, she shifted enough that her arm was around him rather than between them. The jazz ended, and the apartment went quiet, and the city didn't notice. She thought about the invoice, the soft paper, the way she'd worked it between her fingers for weeks until it came apart at the seams. She didn't know where it was, lost somewhere in the weeks, probably, in the operational chaos of the previous months. She didn't need it anymore. "What happens to the contract?" she said. His chest moved, not quite a laugh. Almost. "I believe I'm supposed to offer you $1 million, and you're supposed to find that insufficient." She pulled back enough to look at his face. "Severely underpaid," she said. The laugh came fully then, and this was the version she'd heard once before and not forgotten, the real one, warm and unguarded and belonging entirely to the version of him that existed underneath everything else. It moved through him and through the arm that was around her, and she felt it the way she felt his heartbeat, something present and real that she was going to spend a long time getting used to and intended to. She smiled. He looked at her smiling, and something moved through his face that was going to take her years to fully understand, and she found she was fine with that. She found she was more than fine with it. "Tear up the contract," she said. "It's in the study." "Tomorrow." "Tomorrow," he agreed. She turned back toward the city. The lights of Seoul spread out in every direction to the mountains, to the river, to the edges of the dark where the city finally ran out and the night took over. Below them all of it continued, lives and losses, and the enormous ordinary ongoing fact of people moving through their days carrying their own invoices, their own desperate arithmetic, their own 2 a.m. moments where the options had run out and something had to be decided. She'd stood in a casino basement with nothing but love for her sister and a terminal shortage of alternatives, and she had made a decision in a room full of armed men, and the decision had cost her things she hadn't accounted for and given her things she hadn't expected. And standing here now with the winter air off the Han River against her face, and this man beside her and her sister sleeping with better numbers, and the worst of it behind them, she turned the full shape of it over in her mind one final time and let it be what it was. Not clean, not simple, not the version of a life she'd planned, real, hers. The city glittered below them, and dawn was hours away, and they had time, finally. And she closed her eyes and breathed the cold air and felt his arm around her shoulders, and let herself, at last, come to rest.